Welcome to Proles at the Round Table.
Welcome to Proles of the Round Table. This is Talia. I'm with Proles of the Minion. 8-Hop can't be here today because he got fucked over by TSA. This podcast is sponsored by Brother Gaddafi. And we are here with a bunch of Irish comrades and British comrades, and I am going to go around and have everyone introduce themselves. My name is Talia, and I am drinking a coffee because I have been drinking all day since I've landed in Ireland.
Alex is my name. I'm a member of the Connolly Youth Movement and the Communist Party for the last 5 years.
What are you drinking?
I've just begun.
What beer are you drinking?
Oh, I can't pronounce it. Come on. A tasty beer.
It's a Czech beer. Tasty Czech beer.
Staropramen.
Okay.
I'm Jack. I'm also in the CYM. I'm drinking a Polish beer.
My name is Roy Lennon. I'm a member of the Connolly Youth Movement, and I am drinking a cup of tea from a paper cup.
I'm Ewan. I'm Communist Party of Britain in YCL. I'm drinking punk IPA and I'm not allowed to speak.
I'm Shane. I am also in the YCL and the Communist Party of Britain. And I'm drinking a Copperberg. I am also not allowed to speak.
I'm James. I'm also drinking a punk IPA and I am ignoring Tully's instruction to not speak.
A mutiny by the Brits.
So we are here today to discuss a little bit of Marxist Irish history with the CYM, the Connolly Youth Movement, and I am going to take it over to Jack, who will start with the early history up until post-Civil War to talk about Irish history.
And just chime in whenever you want. Like, I don't know, just ask questions or whatever. But I guess like Ireland, before all capitalism came, before the Brits came, was what we would term a Gaelic society, or a society like the primary economy was based. The economy was primarily based on kinship bounds. Was how land was organized. It was lordship over people and cattle more so than land, as it would have been in England. There, again, the sources are so few, but one of the primary ways that we know about how the society ran was Brehon Law, which was there's big books of law about how Gaelic society operated, and they still exist today, which is cool, and you can read them, but it also gives a kind of an elite view of how the society would have operated, so we're not so exactly sure of how exactly that translated onto ground, but from what it can tell us, I mean, Connolly and a lot of writers in the kind of 19th, 20th century national revival would have called it like Celtic communism, or like this totally egalitarian society. I don't think there's been enough research at all, and I certainly haven't read enough about it, but not entirely accurate. Like, there was very much like a redistributive kind of system, and like what you might call a gift economy, whereby the agricultural surplus would have gone up to the elites of society, but they would have redistributed in feasts or giving it out to their retainers or stuff like that. That would have meant that it wasn't like some kind of a feudal society where it was just all of the wealth accrued at the top, or a capitalist society. Not yet.
That's interesting, actually, about Brehon Law. It took me a while, and I found it an accident, but under Brehon Law, there was no concept of private property. There was only lifelong leases of property. So if you owned a building, or if you lived in a building, or if you owned a cow, or you used the cow for whatever purposes, or you had land, and when you died, it was simply given to another person. So there was no concept of private property. And when the Vikings actually came to cities like Cork, they weren't cities, they settled the initial settlements, but there was people living there and tried to trade with the people or purchase things off them. People didn't actually understand the idea of like, we're going to send you this plot of land, or we're going to sell you this building that you can operate from, because the concept didn't actually exist. So that's maybe that's one of the other things, this concept of primitive communism that existed in Gaelic society, where there was no idea of private property, essentially, the way we understand it now, at least.
Yeah, it was totally like incomprehensible to the Brits. They were, because it wasn't about land of a fixed boundary. It wasn't like, here's a field and this is what I own. It was more about like, how much cattle could that land sustain? How many people could that sustain? So it could move around. Like a lord who would have been called Tierney. So it's not quite like another big problem is that like the terms that we use and the way we think about it was written a lot by English lads who just kind of said, oh, this is like us, except like hundreds of years ago. So that it's the exact same as us, and they're going to become like us naturally anyway. And I guess we'll talk about this later, and I think this kind of applies to a lot of socialist countries as well, where the view that we have when the sources got quite good in the 16th and 17th century, the sources improved, the Gaelic society was a lot more militaristic. It was a lot more hierarchical because it was coming under extraordinary strain from the Brits and from English capitalism in the economy, but also just the brute militarism that they were sending in armies and stuff, which made it more like a self-fulfilling prophecy of this, like, because they said, oh, it's this terrible society, everything's so unfair, everything's so arbitrarily decided, this absolute authority. And I mean, it's just like what the capitalist class say about socialist countries, but a lot of the problems with socialist countries come from the threat that's put upon them by imperialism and capitalism as a total aside.
Do you think the Brits felt threatened by how the Celtic communism, as you said?
Well, as like they took it, maybe we should go a bit into the history, but like as they like took it upon themselves that Ireland was something that they owned, they saw it was the greatest threat, like Connolly says that in Labour and Irish History, that a book that's going to be referenced about 1,000 times.
We'll include it in the show notes.
That it was a rallying cry for resistance against English encroachment into Ireland. So they were able to, come around their Gaelic chieftains, and they were able to come around their Gaelic forms of organisation, as a way of organising themselves. And it was quite effective, because they held them off for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of centuries before in the 17th, and the 17th century was effectively destroyed then. And when there was nothing left in terms of the economy of Gaelic society, it became very easy to totally subjugate the Irish people. But they were also very concerned about the cultural aspect of Gaelic society. Like there was sometime in the 14th century anyway, there was the statutes of Kilkenny, when they explicitly put down, you're not allowed, the English people aren't allowed to speak Irish, they're not allowed to marry Irish people, they're not allowed to dress like Irish people aren't allowed to wear any of their clothes, they're not allowed to have their haircuts. And there was a very specific thing of attacking the culture to try and undermine the whole political system, the whole cultural system, the whole nation, the whole economy, to make it just a part of England, which was their express goal. A guy who kind of really exemplifies that as just one of the most horrific characters of that later period. And we're kind of jumping all over the place, but Edmund Spenser, and he wrote a book called A View of the Present State of Ireland in like the 1590s or something. And it was effectively it was written as like a kind of a dialogue between these two kind of classical characters. And they were just saying, like, one of them's like, oh, maybe we should like be nice to the Irish and like they'll take on our ideas. And the other guy's like, no, we've tried. We have to kill them all and murder them all. And we have to like, it says how it very much outlines how we need to make them forget any idea of an Irish nation and make them English,
It sounds really familiar to how the Brits came over and colonized indigenous folks, like making them completely assimilate to their culture and make them forget where they came from, who they are, and it's basically cultural genocide in my view.
It's geared as well with racial science and the concept of white supremacy, and the origins of that really lie in colonization. The way that you justified being a Christian while simultaneously slaughtering other human beings and raping them and pillaging their country and wiping them out was to simply say that they weren't human. And that view of Ireland probably persists until today. There's recordings and discussions from the House of Commons, for example, in the 1910 1912 kind of period, talking about home rule, and there's cartoons depicting Irish people as too stupid to rule themselves. And this was the idea. You justify colonialism by racial science, and that's the exact same method used today. You dehumanize people from abroad, migrants, asylum seekers, in order to justify the way you're going to treat them. It seems nothing different. It's kind of curious though, and we should move into the Norman invasion, because I think it's ironically enough, it wasn't really an invasion. It was a classic power play by an Irish local prince that had lost a struggle with another local prince and had invited an English, more powerful lord to come in and intervene on his behalf, and essentially the English lord decided to stay. Not really an uncommon feature post-Roman period, or even during the Roman period as to how they colonized things, but it's kind of curious that that's how it played out. And then, was it Henry II that was the monarch at the time? Sought a papal bull from the Pope granting him Ireland.
And the Pope happened to be English.
And
the only English Pope in history.
Happened to be, agreeable with the idea that Ireland should belong to the English. And I think that's where it kind of started. Because then when you have the philosophical and cultural justification for the colonization of a country, really, then it's all about military force. And Jack, you were saying, the Gaelic tribes and communities became more militarized. This was definitely one of the key reasons they became more militarized.
With touching on the point of racial science that you had on, at that point in time with the Brits and the Irish, was there kind of an idea of the racial science that Brits thought they were superior to the Irish and that kind of thing?
Absolutely, yeah. In any writings you want to read, it was just like the Irish people were barbarians, they were totally uncivilized, everything, the way that they organized themselves, the way that they were, just not even beyond that, the way they were inherently in a racial science sense, it was just seen as they were just lesser people, like, absolutely. And to go off your other point, like, it's not just chance that it's very much like what they did to Native American people all across the globe, but in North America, quite materially, there was the same people who did this in Ireland went over, literally sometimes the exact same people like Walter Raleigh or whatever. They would colonize, they would carry out a kind of a colonization in Munster or somewhere or wherever in Ireland. And then like a lot of the people who did it up in Ulster, and they would go over to North America and they'd be given land there, and they would think in the same ways. They would, like they quite consciously were aware we're doing what we did in Ireland. Now we're going to do it over here, So that, like, Ireland at the root of that. Ireland is very much like the very first example of that kind of capitalist imperialism of casting them as the lesser race, and that. And even more so of casting their economic model as like something lesser than, as in this idea of improvement was really important in capitalism arising in England. It rose around in England like the 1550s, 60s, and in the South they started to have this for-profit model in their agriculture where rents were not by customary tenure or anything, or by customary rights. It was just how much money could you make off this, or how much produce could this produce, and a new economic kind of logic started to appear. And they brought this over to Ireland, and they said that these landlords in England, they could make so much more profit out of their land. So they started to say, look at these Irish people, they used to call so much of the land wasteland, and it's land that would have been held in common, or that wasn't just planted with a load of grain or whatever to produce as much as possible. So it was seen as, there's some guy, I think it's, what's the bollocks' name? John Locke. I think he wrote about the Native Americans, and he said that, like,
there is so much similarity
there is
right
a lot of
now
similarity.
that I'm hearing about, like, look at this barren land that you have. Like, you got to go out and get this land and utilize it for yourselves. And
totally.
Even brandishing the Gaels in Ireland at that time as one homogenous group speaks to the colonisation which occurred because they were competing tribes and had varying cultures, and it's only that they sort of unified once that foreign threat showed itself.
Totally. Yeah, I could have gone into. I don't know that much about the early history, but like Ireland would have been, like, people in the south would have been very different from people in the north. For example, they would have had different international ties. They would have just come from different peoples. Like, people in the south, a lot of them could have come from like the north of Spain, more like Islamic roots even and stuff, and people like that. And then people in the north would have more linked up with England and Scotland and the like, and like just totally different peoples, like, but it's, and again, it's just like people think like, people think that Africa is a single country, or people think that the Native Americans just had this one language, one society, one people, you know, and it's just bullshit. It was extraordinarily diverse. And capitalism, it's part of its logic. It needs to just reduce everything to the individual, just to one thing, so it can deal with it, you know? There can't be any cultural variation. There can't be any economic, political variation. And things need to be as simple as possible for them to operate as well as possible within the logic of capital. And so, yeah, it was so easy for them to cast, like, say, all the Gaelic people are the same, and they're all, like, you know, they're all evil barbarians. Like,
some of that legacy persists today because the dialects of the Irish language are ranging and very different as well. Even though there are attempts by some to standardise.
Yeah, like I still can't understand what he's saying most of the time.
Well, it's even in like America, I can't understand what people from the South are saying, and like even just being here, I can tell like every single one of you has a different dialect. Like we're all different, like, but we all share the same values because we're all
communists.
Yeah. So.
I mean, I've said some things to you.
Well, yeah.
Well, I think it's important to know, just to kind of maybe the last point on that, to know like, well, probably not the last point on that, but like how capitalist imperialism is very specific and unlike any before it, in that it draws other economies into its logic and it forces them to engage. Like these Gaelic chieftains, a lot of them kind of wanted to be like, they wanted to take on this new kind of capitalistic landlord role. They started putting like, rather than just having verbal tenures or like customary rents in kind, like just giving up a certain amount of produce, they wanted, like, now you have to have money rents. You know, you have to give up a certain rent, like as we know it today. And there was this process of assimilation of the elite into English society. And that's not just some kind of a subjective process. Capitalism enforces that by like when the Gaelic chieftains started to buy wine and they needed to buy mercenaries from Scotland so that they could fight off the English, they needed to move away from a model that was not at all about economic expansion or creating as much surplus as possible for reinvestment. They needed to move towards that so that they could compete, you know, and then eventually they just started to assimilate more and more into it, you know. And it was the same with a lot of Native American peoples, you know, where they had the means of subsistence taken from them, and more they had to trade in furs and stuff with the French or the English or whoever in order to eat, you know. And that's what capitalism done. It makes it that you, in order to eat, you have to, you know, operate in its logic and you have to deal with it, you know. And
all those events in Ireland as well are often considered the testing ground for the future kind of, I suppose, adventurism and colonization of India or Australia or any of the Commonwealth countries and the rest of the world. Essentially, Ireland was the testing pen for the plantations, which was like, I would say, comparable to Israel, which is another military back plantation, just like Ulster is, and they kind of finessed it, and they took their time. It wasn't something that was done in one go. At first they realised, like, let's go back to the statutes of Kilkenny, for example, and the ban on Normans and English marrying into Irish people. Now, why did they do that? It was because when the Normans came over and spent 250 years here, they ended up marrying Irish people and integrating into their culture. And what you had was a Gaelic Norman ascendancy, aristocracy, military culture, which was quite formidable against a new, fresh English invasion. So they had to anglicise it again, but this time they learned from their mistakes and they did it right. And one of the policies, for example, in Scotland, it was the Highland clearances. In Ireland, it was surrender and regrant. A Gaelic chieftain would give up their title, everything, and the monarch at the time would simply re-grant them their title, but it would be an English title. It would come with English responsibilities, and there would be an oath of loyalty to the British Crown. So it was kind of a concerted effort to finesse colonialism, essentially, so that it could be implemented elsewhere. And you'll see that. You'll see the easy comparisons to be made with places like South Africa and Ireland to be made with other places, because the Orange State, for example, which we'll talk about later, you can compare the 6 counties of Ireland to South Africa very easily, and there's a lot of comparisons to be drawn there.
Yeah, I touch on that later. Actually, the Special Powers Act, which was introduced in the formation of the North to sort of crush any political dissent, was actually adopted by the Minister of Justice in South Africa because he preferred it to their own
Oh my God.
their own legislation.
There's shit like that. Yeah, there was one. Again, maybe you should like give a political overview, but in 1494, because we're just like jumping around, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
In 1494, there was a law, pointing law, that was introduced. He was the Lord Lieutenant, who was kind of the King's representative in Ireland.
Yeah.
And in 1494, it basically meant that the Parliament in Dublin, before it passed anything, it had to be ratified by the Parliament in England.
Mm-hmm.
And they would take that exact law and just bring it across the entire empire. I'm pretty sure they had the same thing in America. I know for certain they had it in Jamaica. And the Brits just put it everywhere. They just consciously said, this worked in Ireland, let's just do it here too.
Mm-hmm.
It's fine.
Yeah, so kind of that idea of kind of capitalist imperialism that you touched on, it kind of occurred to me, had that been done by the Brits before it was done to Ireland? Was that a kind of a new thing for
That
the
might have been
Irish?
answered by you saying that it was that Ireland was the testing
Yeah.
ground.
I kind of thought that as well, but
Yeah.
like,
It's interesting that like, sorry, you do it.
I was thinking because obviously, as Alex said, it happened to India and Australia and
Yeah.
most of them before, but like I can't think of an example before Ireland where
Yeah.
that
Well, like
happened.
the interesting thing about it, and I think it shows how capitalism, and the necessity of imperialism within the logic of capitalism, is that nearly capitalism was only just coming about in England, and already they were like putting it on Ireland, like just concurrently with its.
I would even
becoming a
say
thing in England.
to add to that capitalism wouldn't have happened in England had they not colonised Ireland to begin with, and the whole
Oh,
question
yeah.
of enclosure and the use of cattle. And if you look at Dr. Conor McCabe's book, Sins of the Father, he actually talks about the economic makeup of Ireland, and that today one of the biggest exporter is still cattle. So it still maintains that colonial economic relationship to the rest of the world, where it exports raw resources in exchange for commodities. Or like manufacturing. So
Yeah.
it still kind of has that economic relationship, and its largest trading partner is, well, you can guess who.
Even after so-called independence, the Irish punt was still linked to the sterling.
Yeah.
The British completely controlled the economic model of the new independent Ireland that never changed.
And I think one of the things that I wanted to sort of relate the earlier questions about the sort of colonisation of Ireland is the sort of the otherness, like the otherness of, this is a culture, this is an economic system that we don't understand and that is a threat to us making money, to us, prospering. And I think that I was just wondering if you think that could be related to sort of struggles nowadays, especially with socialist states and socialist struggles across the world.
In the 1600s in England, there was a big fear of Catholicism. There was this thing of a papish conspiracy, and all this stuff. And there was this. I think it's a trick that capitalism has used time and time and time again. In 1605 in England, there was the Gunpowder Plot on November 5th when Guy Fawkes tried to blow up Westminster, and it was immediately used as a massive propaganda point to say, look at the Catholics, look what they're trying to do. And then even more, in 1641, to bring it back to Ireland, there was a massive uprising in Ulster, where it was more so when there was just this was, again, we'll get to this later in more in depth, but there was the plantation of Ulster, and this was a few decades on, and there was just this massive revolt against what the English had put there and what had been what the plantation had done. And there was a massive revolt against that. And a few thousands of Protestant people they were mostly Protestants, were the people who were planted there, were displaced and had to flee, or they were murdered or something. But as soon as it got to England, there was tens of thousands, there was hundreds of thousands of people have been massacred,
Yeah.
And they used that as this great way to justify then 18 years later, Cromwell's other massacre of the country, and then just the destruction of the Irish nation. And then the penal laws and everything that came later, it was all used as using that, again, othering them and saying but then using these propaganda points to really like make it clear. And and that othering the Irish people was a really important part of the colonization of them, and of like creating this idea that it was a just thing to do, and like that's just one example of like a way that they did it quite effectively.
And just to add that, because the base of capitalism or colonialism become the hegemonic kind of modes of economic organization of society, they're also hegemonic in cultural spheres as well, and philosophical spheres. So they create, it's like they produce the justification for what they're doing. There's a British author called Edmund Gibbons, I think, and he has a 900-page book on the Roman Empire. And you can see how he glorifies its concept of civilizing other states in society. And I think the British state, in order to justify what it was doing, but also to bring along like the proletariat and the peasantry with it, had to produce those ideas in order to continue what it was doing. And it's the same here. I mean, we have authors like Gramsci, and I like Gramsci, but I don't like the second author I'm going to name, Althusser from France. I think he's too academic in my opinion, but they both touch upon it, and they say ideological state apparatuses is what Althusser calls them, and that's essentially what you had with the British Empire. In order to, and it goes back to kind of a point I made earlier, is that in order to justify raping somebody and chopping off their head, like in the Congo or in Mozambique, they needed to dehumanize them, and that's part of empire's ideology. It's the same thing in the Middle East, as Jack pointed out. In order to be able to murder people, torture them, and commit atrocity after atrocity, you can't see them on par with you. Like, think about that and take that a little bit out of the Middle Eastern, I suppose, equivalents, and look at it. It's Nazism, and plain and simple. And I think Dr. Walter Rodney actually referred to colonialism as what did he refer to as colonialism in the global south as or he referred to Nazism as colonialism in the global south. That it was simply happening in Europe for the first time, and suddenly people were outraged despite all the imperial powers having been doing it for several hundred years.
Let's just maybe do a political overview just to kind of bring us up to speed. So there was that nice Gaelic society where everything was perfect all of the time. There was no problems ever until 1169 when the English came.
Boo!
Okay, no, sorry, that's not true at all. It was the Vikings who came. No. So there was like a Gaelic society. Christianity came. That's when things around the 3rd, 4th, 5th century. Christianity came to Ireland, and that's when things got shit. And then the Vikings came later. They brought us cities. They brought us war. They
brought us Thor.
And then so the English first came in like 1167 to 69. When, as Alex said, there was a Gaelic chieftain, the King of Leinster. The King of Leinster, Diarmaid of McMurrough, and he basically went to Henry II, who was the king at the time, and was like, I've been kicked out of my kingdom, please give me an army and I'll go take it back. And he was like, no, go ask somebody else. And so he asked these Welsh lords who were known as Anglo-Norman lords. The term Norman came from when Vikings in the 900s, the year 911, came over, the English. Let's go to the simple story, the one we're all told. And they tried to conquer most of the island, and they kind of did. But then within a generation, it had kind of fallen back to what would later become known as the Pale, which is like the east and the southeast of the country. And even there, they would quite, like, as Alex was saying, they'd become quite assimilated into Gaelic culture, into Gaelic society. And I think it's that guy, Edmund Spencer, who I mentioned earlier. Almost the most vitriol in that book is reserved for these English people who had come to Ireland but had just become really Irish, in terms of their way of looking at the world, and they were seen as degenerate people, and that they've fallen to the level of the barbarous Irish people. But Ireland was, so for centuries Ireland was very separate from England. There was its own lords and the like. One of it was kind of the way feudalism operated across Europe at the time, and including England prior to the 16th century, would be that the king would rely on retainers and lords to kind of administer their lands. And Fitzgerald in Kildare was the main earl who kind of kept charge of Ireland, but there was a fear that he would become his own king of Ireland. He had his own kind of plans and schemes and whatever. And one of the big moments in Irish history was 1534, when there was the rebellion of Silken Thomas. It's a whole big story, but basically he revolted against the crown, and him and like the whole family of the Fitzgeralds were all hanged in Maynooth. Oh no, they were hanged in London, but the revolt was in Maynooth. And this led to more of it took Henry VIII, and this is what his father Henry VII had been doing in England, of taking more of a hands-on approach to the way they administered their kingdom, so more of a centralized control, more of an absolutist take, and that was kind of went along with things like Poyn's Law that I mentioned in 1494, and so there was more of like a central English control over what was going on in Ireland, and with that came a lot more militarism. And under Queen Elizabeth, there was brutal wars where there was the attempts at, like in Laois and Offaly, there was an attempt at a plantation, and it was just totally crushed by Gaelic clans in the Wicklow Mountains who came down and just destroyed it. And the same in Munster, they tried to have a plantation, and it basically, there was a massive national revolt that kind of spanned for decades, and it kind of culminated in the 9 Years' War in the 1590s up to 1603, and that was just a total wipeout of the power of the Gaelic chieftains. And then a few years later was the flight of the Earls, when they actually left, a lot of them, with the hopes of coming back with an army, but they never did. So that was one of the final kind of death knells of Gaelic society. But the death knell really came a few decades later when this is I find really interesting, the Cromwellian Revolution. What do they call it in England? The English Revolution in the 1640s.
The English Civil War.
Yeah. The English
Revolution.
Huh?
The Glorious Revolution.
No, that was later. Yeah.
I have a question
Go for
quick.
it,
So the plantations, were they run by the English?
And Scots.
They
Yeah.
were run by the English and the Scots in
Yeah.
Ireland?
There was different ones. There was a failed one that was up in Antrim in like the 1570s or 80s. That was just like some company in London was just said, you guys can do whatever you want there, and it was a total failure. And it shows you how capitalism needs the state to operate. It can't just come about without that state violence putting it in place. And so they made up a scheme, the English crown, to colonize. But Ulster is the prime example, and I guess Rory's going to talk about that a bit later probably, but where they had a scheme of, well, firstly, there was a 9 Years' War, so they wiped out any attempt of resistance that was possible, and that was something that was absolutely necessary. There was a guy, Sir John Davies, who was kind of like an Edmund Spencer character.
So they tried out plantations in Ireland first, and then they brought that over?
Yeah.
Well, and they did it until it worked. Like, it wasn't a sort of, okay, we've tried it and it doesn't work. It was more like, okay, it hasn't worked in Munster, or it has worked proportionately, but let's try it again and let's kind of make tweaks to it. And that's what I meant when I said Ireland was the testing pen. And when you look at events,
I had no idea.
when you look at events like the Berlin Conference, when Africa was essentially carved up between all the imperial powers, a lot of how they actually colonized Africa was done in Ireland first. Let's bring over planters, let's bring over Christianity. As a totally side point, this is why Malcolm X refers to white Christianity as it's theirs. Like, it's not our religion, it's their religion. And this is the exact same thing for Ireland or for Africa or for any of the colonies that the British Empire went to, is that everything was essentially replaced, but Ireland was the testing pen for that. And you see that in the north. The Ulster plantation is the successful plantation that's there to this day, that there's a portion of the population that are culturally, ideologically, philosophically, materially bound to the interests of the British state. And separating that is a very difficult process. I think a lot of the left has kind of got a weak stomach at the moment for the northern national question, essentially for the national question.
That's bullshit.
They see it as something that can be done without pain, but we know from authors like Frantz Fanon, who says decolonization is a violent and painful process, whether you like it or not, because of how much influence the empire has on your territory. Another just side point as well, something that Fanon mentions in Wretched of the Earth is quite interesting, is that rural areas are often the most revolutionary because urban areas have the most amount of capital flowing through them. So even to this day, Dublin is full of factional kind of counter-revolutionary organizations. I would refer to still as the Pale. Like, politically, it's a shithole. There's so many other groups that wreck any working class
I
movement or
did see a
organization.
Trotsky thing.
It's hard to, it's almost more difficult to organize in Dublin than outside of it. And even during like the times of the War of Independence, you'll find that the most active IRA units were the ones who were in East Clare or Tipperary, or more importantly West Cork, where there was as many British troops in West Cork as there was in the rest of the country. So you'll find that rural-urban divide to be I think quite relevant, and going back to like when the Gaelic chieftains were able to fight from the rural countryside, it's no different. All the revolutionary potential was in the countryside.
Just back to plantations, and how imperialism and capitalism itself like adapts to the environment it finds itself in. The plantations were an adaptation of total war on the Gaelic chieftains. The reason why the Ulster plantation was so successful is because every time England tried to militarily dominate the chieftains in Ulster, they failed. Their armies were too strong, and the land and the geography of Ulster was the English found it difficult to penetrate. So they had to sort of incorporate Ulster into the British way of life, and how their towns were planned, and as how their economies were organised, more importantly, because they couldn't defeat them through total war.
But yeah, there's a quote from that basically says that a barbarous country must first be broken by a war before it will be capable of good government. That's a guy, Sir John Davies, in 1605. He was some English lawyer who really kind of like lays the theoretical groundwork for a lot of this English imperialism that we're talking about. And so once it was broken by this war in 1603, they were really able to just try and make their own little world. And if you read writings from the time, it's disgusting, describing, just like was as they were describing the Americas, of this virgin land. It's all this super misogynistic language of that there's nobody there. It's just this empty landscape where you can do whatever you want with it. That's how, for capital, it was just because it was communal land. It was land in an alien traditional economic setup. There was just this empty landscape for it, you know. And once they actually done that through total war and destruction, then they could really put that into place through, and plantations were the way of, because obviously they didn't totally wipe out people, so plantations were the way of, one, checking the resistance, and two, really putting in their own economic model and making Ireland just a dependency of England, you know.
And most of the farmable land, arable land in Antrim and County Down are now heavily unionist areas, because it was Protestants who settled them areas. The Catholics who lived there were driven into the mountains essentially, because the economic they had to control the farmland. So that's how Ireland was related to England through cattle farming.
There's a very famous Irish phrase, "to hell or to Connacht," and that actually originates from the
Cromwellian plantation,
cleaning people out from their land and forcing them out to the least kind of agriculturally, I guess, prosperous land, which is in Connacht, the west of Ireland, kind of Galway, Mayo, which is all quite rocky and stormy and stuff, and driving them out that way, or enslaving them in some cases, and making the east coast kind of clear, the flatlands, the lands for English kind of cattle producers or whoever else, or mass landlords. And it's kind of funny though how that develops, because at the end of the day they still needed workers, so they still brought some Irish back, but only as tenants, as serfs, and that relationship lasted, I would say, maybe until 1922. And the only change in 1922 really was that big Irish farmers took over from large English farmers, if that was the change at all, because a lot of English aristocracy still owned land post the kind of Anglo-Irish Treaty period, still owned 50,000 hectares here or there, and still dominated and still used it and still rented it out.
But the settlers became tenants too.
Yeah.
That's a core reason of why there was so many rebellions, and also Protestant and Catholic rebellions against the British state apparatus in Ireland, including the Irishman, which is probably the last large rebellion in Ireland, which encompassed both Protestant, middle class Protestant, and working class Catholics, or the men of no property, as Wolfe Tone would have put it as well.
But yeah, I guess Cromwell is kind of still the big scary name. But in England, he's quite this is an interesting contradiction that Marx even pointed out in his day, that Cromwell in England is kind of this revolutionary figure. He chopped off Charles I's head. He was kind of this like, kind of like in terms of a bourgeois revolutionary. He kind of brought things on, and his army, the new model army, had a lot of revolutionary sentiments, and they were quite radical at their time. But Marx said the English Republic under Cromwell met shipwreck on Ireland. And what he's really saying there is the importance of anti-imperialism for any kind of revolutionary or emancipatory movement or whatever, is that these guys, like the new model army, was full of these kind of this rising proletarian class who were very radical in their ideas. Like they had all these new types of types of Protestantism that were quite radical, and new ideas about the abolition of private property and anti-enclosure ideas. And Cromwell and the generals of the army just said, if you guys go over and conquer Ireland, we'll give you land there once it's all conquered, and it shows you how imperialism will always be used as a lever in the countries of the imperial core to totally just make any kind of real radical change a dead letter, and any kind of real emancipatory movement, it's a dead letter while you're still colonizing other places. It's as if, how could there be a socialist revolution in America while it's still doing what it's doing everywhere else? It's like, it's unthinkable, and it's the same with England and Ireland.
It's the same. Toussaint, the Haitian revolutionary, writes about the French Revolution. He's like, where was the emancipation for all the colonies that passed? Nowhere.
Totally.
The fact of the matter is that the French Republic was the French Republic for the people who lived in France, not for its colonized subjects. And that's quite a fascinating contradiction.
Haitians had to revolt.
And as a side note, John Bellamy Foster, in his pamphlet on imperialism, actually talks about it. He says in the 70s and 80s, everybody was talking about imperialism, but today it's probably the least used word, like among leftist groups. They don't talk about the role of monopoly capitalism and the role of imperialism, even though it's probably the most essential contradiction to take on in countries who are in the imperial core. And obviously Ireland isn't in the imperial core, so kind of for us it's what's the impact of imperialism on Ireland rather than who's Ireland colonising, because I think the only place Ireland colonised was like the Scottish mountains back in the 6th century or something.
I basically want to say how, you talked about how Cromwell sort of vindicated he made a point of colonising Ireland by taking these people and saying, these are all these radical points, but look, we'll go and deal with this first. But even now, we have a monarch. We have a monarch that people still listen to in Britain, and yet we still have a statue of Cromwell outside of our parliament. It's complete bollocks. People in our country make points about Republican, even New Labour. They put a portrait of Cromwell and stuff like that, and it's like people try and think that we've moved on as a country, but we haven't.
We've got to take down those statues.
We have to, exactly, but
that's what we're doing with Confederate soldiers statues. We got to take them down.
We have a statue of Charles and we have a statue of Cromwell next to each other. We're still the same bastards that are occupying Ireland. It's just, I don't think. It's just bollocks.
It's a curious observation as well that I don't really see the British left calling for the abolition of the monarchy. It's not a topic of discussion. It's not a statement. It's nothing. It doesn't exist as a concept, and it should.
I agree.
In British society, it's a very controversial thing because the monarchy has a really well-developed cult of personality around it. But
it does absolutely nothing. It's just a parasite.
It's people who believe they have a divine right to rule over other people. It's hysterical in the age of 2019 going into 2020 that they exist and that there isn't some sort of serious backlash. But then people have the
audacity. Bring that guillotine out.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's kind of the audacity to comment about cults of personality around socialist leaders or whatever. It's nonsensical, but it's one of the many contradictions within social democracy, I guess.
I mean, there's often talk of Irish Republicans and their relationship to the British Parliament, and as such, and therefore their relationship to the Queen through the oath. You have to pledge allegiance to the Queen if you want to sit in the British Parliament. That's not only an issue for Irish Republicans, that should be an issue for the Labour Party and British Republicans themselves. They're pledging allegiance to the Queen as well when they sit in that Parliament.
I mean, I suppose there's certain British MPs like Dennis Skinner who quite regularly refused to take the oath to the Queen and instead just took it to the overall state. who kind of go against that kind of line. But other than the Sinn Féin MPs who refuse to take their seats, there isn't really any other example of that, is there? As far as I can think of.
I know Claire Hanna, who was recently elected for the SDLP in South Belfast, pledged her allegiance to the people of South Belfast instead of pledging allegiance to the Queen, while still sitting in a British Parliament. So
Yeah.
All right. So, so Cromwell. So that he had the they had their great, nice revolution over there. They chopped off the king. Oh, liberation. Then he came 1649 and he massacred the people of Ireland. Massacres in Drogheda, in Waterford, everywhere. It was just this total destruction of the country. And that was then completed, you could say, with another kind of bourgeois revolution in England, the Glorious Revolution, as it's called, in 1689, when King William of Orange took the throne, and it was again seen of this kind of just this the capitalist class more so taking over the realm, the reins of state, and more so, you know, using the English state for their interest. And they went over to Ireland, and if there was any kind of liberatory, emancipatory thing going on with that, I don't think there was. But if there happened to be, it wasn't in Ireland because
it was an excuse.
Yeah,
the British state used basically.
Yeah,
it was because James was a Catholic. They said.
Yeah. Exactly.
But also in Conor McKean's book Money, he points out that the contest between which was Dutch. The emergent Dutch financial capitalism and old school British capitalism, as it were, that just played out in Ireland, and the Dutch form of financial capitalism just became to dominate the British state.
And it was played out very bloodily with the siege of Derry and all this total war, the Battle of Boyne, that just destroyed the land and whatever. But after all that, there was just England really. They destroyed Gaelic society. There was only like the barest elements of it left, like maybe some poets who had been a big part of Gaelic society, and it was just then like that's when they really was just their colony. It had been for a long time, I think, but from then in the 1700s onwards, it was just a total dependency. And any time Ireland had a threat of posing a competition to English capital, there was laws put in place straight away. There was the Cattle Acts, there was the Navigation Acts, there was all these different acts that meant that basically restricted the free trade of Irish capitalists to even that. Anytime there was any hint of Irish industry growing, it was just totally put down. So just that you were just there, not to compete with us, just to feed our people and just to so we could feed us and our empire rather, and that we can take resources from you and the like. In the 1700s there was still loads of revolts, like all the time. There was the peasant struggles were the primary ways. There was a lot of secret societies. There was the White Boys, which I think is a pretty funny name. The Oak Boys. There was the Defenders, Peeping Day Boys. And there was sometimes sectarian problems with Catholicism and Protestantism, but a lot of times there was like a lot of like union along those lines, or just along class lines. Yeah, and against a lot of that the free trade stuff I was talking about, kind of to go back, was it was the same thing that basically the American Revolution was about, that they had their revolution because there was limits on the capital's ability to free trade. And there was attempts of that in Ireland in 1782. There was Grattan's Parliament, which one of the big slogans was free trade or else. So it was just the Irish capitalists wanting their own parliament to be able to do that, and they, whatever about Irish capitalists, but they weren't allowed that even. That was kind of half allowed, and then it was crushed. And then after the French Revolution, there was two of the most famous revolutions, I guess, or revolutionary movements. There was the United Irishmen, and there was Emmet's 1803 uprising. What's that one known as? The 1803?
No idea.
The 1803 one, whatever.
It's also worth pointing out that all these uprisings were hugely unpopular and commanded no real interest from the working class. Robert Emmet's one had about 3,000 people participating in it. They were killed, and that was kind of the end of it. It's only really later that people kind of, I suppose, placed them, I don't want to say on a pedestal, but that is kind of how it turned out, and they put them in a historiography of Republican history, and I think that it's the Fenians who actually went and did that and connected their struggle to the one that Wolfe Tone and Robert Emmet had. So it's kind of one of those moments where, much like 1916, I think there was quite a lot of retrospective, I suppose, respect for it. The only difference being is that today, I don't think Irish people would participate in an uprising similar to the 1916 one. And if one did occur, it would have the same kind of almost rejection that it had when it did occur in the streets of Dublin in Easter 1916.
Well, the rebellion under the United Irishmen was much larger than the Fenian rebellion. I think 30,000 died in the rebellion of the United Irishmen.
Yeah.
So they seem to peter out as it went on, claiming the political lineage, which is something that still exists in Ireland today with 1916.
It shows you again the imperialist thing that they were inspired by the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and it was fine for them to have their revolutions for the capitalist class, but Ireland couldn't because that interrupted or interfered with the interests of British capital and British imperialism. So even these like bourgeois democratic revolutions were just totally squashed. So whatever. Ireland was total colony, and in the 1840s, the famine is one of the biggest kind of examples of that, where millions, where the population still hasn't reached the level that it was prior to the famine. It was at 8 million. I think it's like 6 million today or something still. But that was really just like any idea that was there was the failure of the potato crop, but any idea that was the reason there was still tons and tons of food getting like shipped out of the country. There was it was just an excuse, and this is what capitalism always uses, these moments of horror to further entrench itself. And Marx has a great little section at the end of chapter 25 of Capital where he talks about the famine and how, because these people were evicted from their land, they were wiped out, they left the country. It was a great win for the capitalist class because all of this land was able to be taken over, and just any land that was that was held by the peasantry of Ireland was just taken by the capitalists. This was like really the final death knell of any kind of a peasant society. Really, obviously, still peasants were still the primary class in Ireland, but in terms of the society operating with them owning land, there was a proletarianization on a scale that hadn't been seen before with this. And Marx talks about that. I just wrote down a little quote. Marx said that her depopulation must go yet further, that she may fulfill her true destiny, that of an English sheep walk and cattle pasture. So they just wanted to depopulate the country, and it was a great thing because it's not even like in England, if it was depopulated, that wouldn't have been a problem because, where are we going to get people to work in the factories? But in Ireland, it wasn't. It was just an agricultural colony. It's the same way they don't give a shit about anywhere in any colonized country in the world. They don't give a shit about the people in it because they can just take that land and they can just use it to put more animals on or grow more cash crops on or whatever, they can just take the land. And the famine was just a great way for them to do that. And
it was just a genocide.
Yeah.
The famine was just a genocide that the Brits were doing against the Irish. Like everything that they had done, like exporting all the food and not importing any food to the Irish. Yeah. It was all intentional, and it was a way to get them off the land.
Yeah, it clears the small peasants off the land, clear centralisation of the farmland essentially to feed the growing English proletariat.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's fascinating as well, again, if you look at the discussions in the House of Commons between various MPs, these are very honest, very they're not obfuscating the fact that there's something happening in Ireland. What they're more concerned about are the market mechanics of subsidising grain. So there was one of them I listened to on the Irish History podcast, and one MP was saying that, well, we can't subsidise the price of grain because that would bring its price down and that would be interfering in the market and would be against our free market principles. So that was the kind of the core of his opposition to it. Whereas in reverse, for example, when protests broke out and almost a riot broke out in Youghal, for example, there was no problem sending in a British cruiser with Marines on it in order to, you could say, interfere in the market to restore the market. So it's quite fascinating that the logic works one way, but it doesn't work the other way. And the logic is applied to this day. So, for example, again, during famine times, the creation of the Office of Public Works, where starving people were given jobs, low-paid jobs to, for example, dig roads that led nowhere, so that they'd get a wage and that they could then get some overpriced food. And ultimately, the person who benefited from this was the person who was selling the highly expensive food. And if you look at Ireland today, for example, if you look at the housing crisis, housing schemes like HAP, housing assistance payment, well, what does it do, right? So if I'm a tenant and you're a landlord and my rent is €1,800, HAP will give me €1,000 and the rest I pay myself. But the most important thing here is that it upholds market mechanics. It makes sure that the price of housing remains high, that money continues to flow into the pocket of the landlord, and that there's no interference, i.e. driving down the cost of housing. So it's kind of interesting that the logic pervades, and it's very much out in the open. The debate in the House of Commons, they're not subtle about it. They know what's happening, but they don't really care.
Yeah, I think one example of that really shows you how it was used as a method of primitive accumulation is that there was a Poor Relief Act in like 1847, and the whole basis of the act was that you would get work and you would get some money to buy some food, and so that's good, but you didn't get the work if you owned more than a quarter of an acre of land. So if you own more than that, you couldn't get the work. So people would like have to sell their land in order to get this, in order to work, you know? So it was just like really maliciously and very consciously a method of capital accumulation to just further entrench Ireland in the logic of capitalism and under the boot of British imperialism, like, you know?
So kind of with the famine in Ireland, is that kind of similar to what later happened in Bengal in the 1940s?
Yeah, totally. I mean, that was the one where Churchill quite consciously was taking food and goods out of India, and like millions died. And
could it kind of be said again, like with what Alex said before, is that was kind of the testing ground for that, and then it comes back through and they do it again in Bengal, and it still works the same.
Totally, yeah. Because capitalism is the same in India as it is in Ireland, or imperialism rather is the same, you know. So the same thing works. If people do not matter compared to capital, you know. The same logic.
It's just a side point. The famine in Ireland is often compared to the Holodomor in Ukraine under the Soviet Union regime. Compared often, actually, and I think it's quite a fascinating comparison. It's like all things in liberal discourse. It kind of drops all the nuance and just says, look, famine here, famine there, and drop the equal signs in between. And it's quite fascinating to see the different approaches taken by what a socialist country took in order to alleviate famine and ultimately stop famine happening ever again in that part of the world, as opposed to how an imperialist state took measures. And in fact, for example, Ireland had another famine in 1925 that's not really commented or talked about, where a couple of thousand people died, and it was just kind of like, that's kind of an actual thing, blah blah blah, even though there was enough food really to feed everyone. So it's kind of fascinating that the comparison is often made, but it doesn't stand up to any scrutiny, really.
I was just going to say, regarding sort of how the famine is portrayed, especially in Britain, there's a very sort of conscious denial of any sort of complicity on our part in it.
Of course.
In that it's always treated as if, the Irish, they liked potatoes too much and all the potatoes went bad, so they all died.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's all very treated in that kind of manner. Whereas there is pretty much no mention of the way that food was exported and aid wasn't given to the Irish during that time.
Aid wasn't let in. There was aid coming, but they weren't
they sent the boats back and all that.
To be completely honest, in a lot of the British discourse about it, it's kind of the butt of a joke, which is dark to say the least. With people, hundreds and thousands of people died.
Yeah.
Well, like America doesn't talk about sending boats back full of Jews escaping the Holocaust. They sent them back to Germany. So why would Britain talk about what they did to the Irish during the famine?
And there's talk that way in schools as well.
Yeah, in
It's
my
taught that
school
way
it
in
was
schools
taught
as
that
Oh
way.
yeah.
It's not that way in
Even-
Ireland
even
as
in
well.
Ireland,
Yeah,
yeah,
really?
It
The
is.
famine
Yeah.
happened because of the potato blight.
yeah,
The
yeah.
British state had no role in it. So
Totally.
my
imperial
God.
education is homogenous as much in Ireland as it is in Britain. And what's interesting is, I presume, have you all seen the movie Black 47?
Yes.
Where
I love that movie.
where your man just goes around killing people, but
It's great.
the article responses to it, especially like in Metro.co.uk and a few other British newspapers, were like, British viewers horrified by what the Brits did to Ireland. It's like, that says quite a lot really about the British education system and how it's geared.
Exactly.
And I think in imperial core countries, again, like Britain or America, the education system reproduces the ideas of the ruling class.
Oh yeah.
That what you're doing is grand and there's no problems with it.
Yeah.
And if there are mistakes, oops, it was an accident.
It just dumbs down the population. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing.
Sure, didn't you just celebrate Thanksgiving?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it taught that way in the Republic as well?
Yes.
Jesus.
Yeah, it's not too far off.
That seems like completely against everything that the whole point of having the Republic would be. Is that
Yeah.
Well, the same thing happens to Connolly when he's taught in schools. He's eradicated of any socialist or trade union.
I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't know anything about Connolly until I started following kind of COIM stuff. So
He's
that
just-
was
And
not at all in British.
Irish
Nope.
schooling, from my experience anyway, he's just portrayed as this like nationalist figurehead.
Yeah.
His whole trade union activity and his life of trade unionism is never mentioned.
Yeah, in the South, in the schooling system, Connolly has maybe a couple of sentences about him. There's nothing about his socialism, about the fact that he kind of read Marx back to front and understood Marx and talked about Marx.
Yeah.
There's nothing about it. He was just one of the leaders of the 1916 Rising, and it was great. Nice mustache, so on and so forth.
I think of it like I don't
All
think
the
we
best leaders have good mustaches.
I don't think we were taught anything about Irish history at all
Of course.
throughout my
not.
entire
Yeah.
education.
Shocked, yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah.
And then I think maybe we touched on the famine maybe for 10 minutes, but it wasn't in the light that like this is something that was pushed on by the British. It was like what you said about like it was the blight and all this kind of shit that isn't true. But
I love that there's a quote from Lenin at the beginning of the State and Revolution, which was copy handy. But at the first paragraph, I think, where he goes like,
I'm sure there's one around
there's
here.
somewhere here, somewhere, surely. But he says that he's talking about Marx, and he's like, just what you're saying, Rory, that like whenever like during Marx's life, he was totally maligned. He was kicked out of every country he was in. And it was the exact same with Connolly. He was totally maligned. He was a working class guy. He lived in shit most of his life. And he was a total enemy of the ruling classes, primarily for being a socialist, but also a Republican. And now, in his afterlife, Irish Republicans was kind of okay for the Irish state. It's its whole basis. They have to kind of pay some lip service to it. So he's kind of like, oh, just a nationalist figure. He liked Ireland,
Yep.
But being a socialist, no way, And there's no mention of it anywhere.
And like, to exemplify the point, you only have to look as far as the centenary celebrations of 1916 Easter Rising and how the state went about it. Very, very apolitical.
Yeah.
Very just devoid of any class politics at all. And that's what legacy, that's what a lot of young people will take from the 1916 Easter Rising and nothing more.
So I guess to move on, so things continued to worsen from the famine onwards. There was the land war in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, which is a great example of just peasants organizing themselves and struggling, and a lot of like class solidarity. It's where the word boycott comes from. It comes from there was a guy, I think he was down in Cork, Charles Boycott, and he was one of these terrible, terrible landlords. And it was a tactic of the Irish peasantry where they would just say, this guy's a piece of shit, ignore him, don't deal with him, don't have anything to do with them. And in Charles Boycott's case, he was ran out of the country. He just left because no one would deal with him because he was just known as a terrible landlord. And so they would attack the cattle of terrible landlords. There was just a total attack on landlordism. But it was the Land League was the kind of institutional framework for that. And that kind of went hand in hand then with a kind of a rising national sentiment from the late 19th century. which was kind of best, I guess, politically represented by the Irish Parliamentary Party at the time, where like most like it was the primary representation at the time, and they were like had the balance of power in Westminster for decades, where either the Whigs or the Tories would have to kind of kowtow to them. And the Whigs were in there for ages because they gave some concessions. There was Land Acts and the like that gave the redistributed land somewhat as a result of this class struggle.
Just to add to that, though, in the undercurrents of that, you had the formation of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and the publication of the first document, I think, in 1868. And it was a very radical document. It was probably more radical than the 1916 Declaration of Independence. And the reason for that is, by the way, it's speculated that members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood participated in the International Men's Association, so the first international with Marx in London, and the demand to address the social question of social inequality and class rubbed off on them, and they actually adopted like things like the common ownership of the land, and you find that this is a reoccurring theme in Irish Republican publications all the way from their document in 68, I think it's 68 now, I'm not 100% certain, to the 1916 Rising, to the 1919 First Dáil programme, and they all talk about the public ownership of resources, the democratic management of society. Now you can kind of take a guess as to what that alludes to. So the language they kind of adopted, they're not popular. They're militaristic. They carry out the Phoenix Park murders, which is the assassination of the Viceroy and his mate out in Phoenix Park. And this kind of stuff doesn't really create any sort of political atmosphere or mood in Ireland. The Land League is what dominates the Irish landscape, but you do have a militaristic organisation brewing in the background, and they have quite a big role to play in 1916 and the War of Independence. In fact, they have the instrumental role to play. They essentially organise both events, but you kind of see it that post-famine, the revolutionary fervour, despite the decimation of the population, it's not gone at all. In fact, it's kind of, after Robert Emmet in 1803, there's about a 70-year gap. And it's back. It's back with a bang, you could say. And it looks back to people like Robert Emmet and Wolfe Tone. It synthesises their ideas, fuses the question of national and social kind of questions and puts them together. A totally relevant point. But before Marx started writing about political economy, there was a lad from West Cork called William Thompson. And he wrote about capitalism. He wrote about primitive accumulation.
He wrote about feminism.
And he wrote about feminism. So he actually wrote about quite a lot of the subjects long before Marx, maybe 20 or 30 years. So it's kind of interesting that Ireland produced its own thinkers who grasped this contradiction that of Irish nationalism, that what's Irish nationalism worth if it's going to be fucking Irish beef barons or whatever, similar to what Connolly essentially says 50 or 60 years later.
Yeah. There's a great chapter in Connolly's Labour and Irish History where he talks all about William Thompson and like his experiment with social. He was kind of a utopian socialist and his ideas and how he was totally in tune with Marx. But he definitely didn't read Marx. But he's super interesting.
I remember, just as a anecdotal story, a member of the Communist Party spread a rumour about 30 years ago that there was a bust of William Thompson in Prague, in the Czech Socialist Republic. And the way he spread the rumour was that apparently he used to drink with the bishop out in West Cork. And he told the bishop, and the bishop started telling people anyway. And one lad from the Communist Party went to Prague, and he was like, "There's no bust here." And it was in the media, it was in everything. I have to look it up. But you find CP members in Ireland tend to make things up for kind of gullible kind of fools. So I'll give two more examples and just leave it at that. Again, both Cork examples. Another example is that there was a May Day march, I think in 1985 or something like that. And a journalist asked one of them, well, how many people attended the May Day march? Now, there were 200 people at it. They conspired together to tell the journalist that there was 10,000. And lo and behold, the newspaper said that there was 10,000 people at the May Day march.
Yes.
And the last thing, right, again, all in the William Thompson tradition, I think, is that there was quite a lot of American tourists in the local in Cork on Spalpeen Fánacht, and there was a band playing and there was a microphone up, and one of the comrades went up to the microphone when the band was on break and said, "Minute of silence for comrade Kim Jong-il, who studied in Cork in the 1970s in the local universities." And you should have seen the jaws drop on the kind of the tourists. They couldn't, fact or fiction to know, but
I'd be cool with that.
all comes from CP members, all untrue, and to this day, probably held up as truth somewhere.
Yeah.
That's lovely.
totally irrelevant. But William Thompson, interesting character.
Good guy.
Yeah. There's a
good friend of the Connolly Youth Movement.
There's a plaque for him out in West Cork, actually. I've been there. There's a little just plaque on the house that he was in.
Oh,
yeah. So he is kind of remembered, but obviously.
Yeah. So yeah, around that time in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was a rise in national movement of like Irish republicanism, Irish nationalism, that was primarily in the Irish Volunteers, which kind of harkened back to 1782 and 1798 when there was these volunteer forces that kind of organized themselves militantly, and they started to organize themselves, not really with any clear plan, just like we want independence. And like we call ourselves the Connolly Youth Movement because amid that kind of rising movement, James Connolly stands out as the guy who was saying, well, there's others as well, but who was saying that there needs to be an answer to the social question of Ireland as well as the national question, which leads me to this extended Connolly quote, which is everybody's favourite Connolly quote. And that the first time I ever read it, I was immediately a socialist afterwards, having not been a socialist before. I'll read it now.
He's great. He is a great writer.
He's amazing, yeah. Everyone should read him. If you remove the English army tomorrow and hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, unless you set about the organisation of the Socialist Republic, your efforts would be in vain. England would still rule you. She would rule you through her capitalists, through her landlords, through her financiers, through the whole array of commercial and individualist institutions she has planted in this country and watered with the tears of her mothers and the blood of her martyrs. England would still rule you to your ruin, even while your lips offered hypocritical homage at the shrine of that freedom whose cause you had betrayed. It would be tantamount to a public declaration that our oppressors had so far succeeded in inoculating us with their perverted conceptions of justice and morality that we had finally decided to accept these conceptions as our own and no longer needed an alien army to force them upon us. So yeah,
and it's curious how that wasn't the prevailing view in the early 20th century among Republican circles. You'll find that people like Arthur Griffith, who founded Sinn Féin, who Sinn Féin today would kind of try to claim lineage to. Arthur Griffith in 1905 was a German-Austrian monarchist who thought Ireland would be better off under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So you had these kind of wackos who came from aristocratic, upper-middle-class backgrounds who had no interest in class relations, had no interest in addressing the class question. And Connolly was definitely one of the few, I count on one hand, people who actually began to talk about the question of socialism. And that is because of his upbringing in Scotland. That is because of his interactions with other socialists. Yeah. That is because of his, you could call, formal Marxist education that pretty much nobody else had in Ireland. I don't think he has any contemporaries that had a similar education. No, I don't know of any. I don't know. Does anybody spring to mind?
No,
I don't think
exactly. So. Definitely, I mean, the biggest force for kind of radical politics in Ireland at the time was trade unionism. And Jim Larkin is kind of one of the exemplars of that, of the ITGWU, the Irish Trade and General Workers Union. That was the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, excuse me. And that just spread across the country, and it was really popular, and the people were getting engaged with it. And there was in 1913, there was the 1913 lockout when workers who were a member of the union weren't allowed to come to work, and there was a big strike that lasted for months in the city. And in 1918, there was the munitions strike, which was the only successful strike against wartime policy in Europe, where they refused to go to be conscripted, the Irish people. They refused to go off and shoot some Germans. And then in 1920, there was the rail strike, where in the middle of the War of Independence, they refused to operate the trains that had anything to do with the British Army and the British soldiers. So unionism was a massive force in Ireland at the time, and Connolly spent most of his life. He also went over to America for years, and
he was in IWW.
Yeah.
Like he's a pretty. That's how I knew of him, was because of IWW.
Cool.
That's how socialism got really popular in America, was because of unionism.
Yeah, well, it was the same in Ireland. It was kind of the way, but there was also one of the things that's totally written out of the national history as we understand it today, is that there was enormous, and in this, so 1916 happened, there was the Easter Rising, Connolly and the Irish Citizens Army. The Irish Citizens Army had been set up in 1913, during the 1913 lockout, as a way to protect strikers from strike breakers or whatever, just to organize the workers so that they could defend themselves. And that would go on to become one of the forces, along with the Irish volunteers, that started the rising. Between the Irish Citizens' Army was far smaller, there was only a few hundred, but they were explicitly a socialist, working class, militant organisation.
I believe Lenin referred to them as the first Red Army of Europe.
That's beautiful. And they had a women's division too, right?
No, they actually integrated women into the ranks, and they were the only Republican organisation who did that. They were, I think it was like 20% of all officers were women, and this was basically unheard of in Republican circles because Catholicism, conservatism were all very much dominant, and like that's something else to take into consideration as to how Connolly would have been perceived by other nationalist leaders talking about socialism. And he talked in Socialism Made Easy, he talks about how socialism is as much of a foreign import as capitalism, and that it's not a question of what's foreign or not, it's a question of what's good for the entire island of Ireland.
Yeah. And but another expression of working class politics, and more so of socialist politics, is that after 1917, the Russian Revolution, big fan of the Russian Revolution.
Woo woo! Yay!
It was a massive inspiration for the people of Ireland. Just like the United Irishmen, 1798 and 1803, there was a massive inspiration from the French Revolution, that they were really inspired by it, and they got involved with the United Irishmen coming off the back of that. From the Russian Revolution, there was, I think in 1918, there was a demonstration of thousands in the city where they celebrate the Bolshevik Revolution.
And a mass meeting in the Mansion House, addressed also by Countess Markievicz, not exactly known for socialist politics at the time, but nevertheless quite a large figure in Republican circles. So it's kind of interesting that initially the Russian Revolution is very much welcomed, but that kind of changes after, I think, because of the role of Catholicism in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, but one of the expressions of that is that all over Ireland, I've read that there's hundreds of Soviets that took people organising themselves across the country. The first one I think was in Monaghan, where an asylum, the workers just took over, and for weeks they were running it themselves. But the most famous example, and probably the most successful, was down in Limerick in April 1919. It was the centenary this year. There was what was the story? There was martial law put on the city, and they had to have a pass to go to work and to go around the city, and the workers just said, "Feck off, we're not accepting this," and they just took over the city themselves, and they printed their own currency, they started to distribute the bread themselves, they just started to put out their own passes, they started to run it themselves for, I think it was a week or two.
4 months. No, 4 months. Yeah, no, it lasted quite a while. And actually the reason it shut down was because they approached the Irish Congress of Trade Unions and they asked for help, and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions refused to help them and said it was too radical, we can't get involved with this, it's too political. So it's kind of interesting. And I would say as well, just as a side point, that the Limerick Soviet is probably the last explosion of working class power in the early half of the 20th century, because after the formation of the Free State and the partition of Ireland, you have, as Connolly quoted, the carnival of reaction. You have the consolidation of the Free State, the little bourgeois state totally tied to Britain, that crushes any sort of socialist republican ideas. It executes people like Liam Mellows, who was very much he was the chief of staff of the anti-treaty IRA based in Munster. The Communist Party actually approached him in 1921 to try to form a Munster Soviet Republic. He wasn't kind of game for it, but nevertheless, it kind of says a lot that there was a dialogue there anyway that existed between communists and radical Republicans. People like him are executed, and the state simply consolidates itself and creates this reactionary, conservative, Catholic shithole. And in the north, you have the foundation of the Orange State. So it's I think the Limerick Soviet is probably one of the last explosions of this working class strength to take over the city, to administer the city, to run the city. And by the way, the author, there's no posters here, but
it's downstairs.
Yeah, the Forgotten Revolution, the author talked about it. I went to the book launch and I read the book, and he talks about it, and he says basically the only way it ran was because of the support of the IRA. And when it became too left-wing, the Bishop of Limerick, who had supported the Limerick Soviet up until this time, withdrew his support. He put pressure on the Sinn Féin mayor of Limerick to also withdraw his support, and subsequently the IRA also withdrew their support. So it kind of shows a lot that, again, Catholicism was essentially the rod that kind of whipped it all into place. Yeah. And even though it was clearly to the detriment of the Irish working class for the Limerick Soviet to fall, it didn't matter. The role of the Roman Catholic Church was always to be the vanguard against any sort of social. It didn't even have to be communism. Should they call people who are right-wing communists. So, like I think the Limerick Soviet is a tragedy in many ways. And what you find about Limerick today is that when we had the repeal referendum, Limerick was one of the most reactionary hotbeds for anti-repeal like demonstrations. There was thousands of choir boys singing Catholic hymns on the bridge and stuff. So
is that for the abortion?
Yeah. So fascinatingly enough, from being one of the most active political places, and actually the guy who organised the trade union movement there was one of Connolly's lieutenants, a man from Cove. I can't remember his name, but Connolly sent him in 1915 and said, "Go organise beyond the Galties."
Yeah.
Can't remember his name. And he ended up organising the ITGW in Limerick. So it's quite fascinating that with the defeat of socialism, just like all over the world, by the way, reactionary views and reaction kind of takes over and dominates the political landscape in many forms. And you see that in Limerick to this day. Like Limerick is probably the largest urban working class city outside of Dublin in the country, and it's fucking right wing as hell. There is no real socialist politics there. Sorry, I don't consider Trotskyists as leftists. So
they're anti-communist.
So they're not.
Grover Fur has said.
So I don't recognize them. Like I don't recognize whatever gains they've made, the one or two councillors, as wins for socialist politics.
No.
So there has been nothing there, and it's only gotten worse there. We'll talk about the CYM in Limerick later, but that's just a side point, I suppose.
You talk about the role of trade unions in republicanism, but with the death of Connolly he was essentially the last strong trade union leader in Ireland. Jim Morgan had already left for America, and so by the time the Civil War sort of erupted, the Labour Party, who supported the trade unions and were the political wing of the trade unions in Ireland, they supported the Free State, and the trade unions allowed other people to take dominant roles in the Republican movement. So Labour politics was essentially written out of the New Ireland, and the new state was just essentially a new and improved version of Home Rule.
Connolly was the link between socialism and republicanism, and once he was executed. But also, what's the name of the chief of staff of the Irish Citizens Army?
Jack White.
No, Jack White was a captain. There was another man, Michael Mallon. Michael Mallon was also one of the people executed in Kilmainham jail, and the reason he was executed was because he was a similar Connolly-eyed kind of person who had gross influence, and the two of them were both shot. And once that happened, the people who led the labour movement, the trade union movement, didn't have the same aggressive politics as Connolly did in synthesising the two. Like even in the early days of the Civil War, for example, the War of Independence, the view that the trade union movement took was that we're not a political organisation, so we shouldn't take a side. Which is the view the trade union movement takes today on issues, and it's a disgrace. These people should be fucking shot and fucking hung from lampposts. Like, it is a political issue, and it has to be a political issue. It's totally unacceptable, and that's the view they took. Like, and it just degenerated from then on. It was a total disgrace to Connolly. And I mean, there was plenty of people who believed in Connolly. Most of the people who were in the Irish Citizens Army or kind of the Connollyeites would have been on the anti-treaty side in the Civil War. In fact, all of them. The Communist Party would have been probably a collection of these people and was on the anti-treaty side of the Civil War. So,
we have the same issues with unions being like they started out super radical and now they're just full of reactionaries, and they're like some of the most racist people I've ever met in my life, and they don't understand the idea of solidarity, and there's like any hint of socialism has just been ripped out of unionism, and it's a real tragedy, I think.
The Labour Party played the most important role in that. Like they went into coalition with Fine Gael.
The first government was the Labour Party propping up what is known as Fine Gael today. So you kind of have to wonder how ideologically developed the people around Connolly were if it took 6 years for them to prop up something that he would have fought against with guns, essentially.
Fine Gael being like the Irish Tories, basically, just the neoliberal,
the Irish
party.
fascists, basically.
Yeah, fascists. I would say fascists. I mean, because it was Cumann na Gael before, and then in the 1930s they formed the blue shirts, which was the equivalent of the brown shirts, and then they formed Fine Gael. So, you kind of have to wonder how bad the party was really around Connolly.
Yeah.
I guess from that we can learn like how important education and theory is, and learning how to use that in practice for sure.
I love that Fred Hampton quote, from the video.
I know.
Like, Jomo Kenyatta, he took over in Kenya, but he's an ex-revolutionary now. He had the revolution, but now he's just an oppressor, you know, and that's the exact thinking that
I
Connolly
like
had,
the
you know?
theory without practice ain't shit. That's my favorite. That's what I thought you were talking
Sorry,
about.
Yeah, that's better. Yeah. But yeah, I think the trade union movement, the Soviets, they all really represent a potentially radical track for the Irish Revolution that was squashed. And I think it's a real. I think Fanon talks about that, where the elites of empire, they started to say, here's the line where it's like decolonize quickly. The imperial elite started to do that because if they they just give them national independence, but then don't bring the war too far, don't bring the revolution too far, or else socialist ideas will start to take root and workers' organization will start to take root. So they had the total war, the War of Independence, which was just brutal. They murdered thousands of people, and or what was the count? I'm actually not so sure.
Well, the British state actually, unironically, executed less people than the new Free State, the Irish Free State, did in the Civil War. So the Free State executed 83 anti-treaty Republicans, and the British state, when executing people like death sentence, executed less people. So it's kind of telling that the new Irish state, as you will, in the south, 26 counties, was much more aggressive in squashing any sort of socialist ideas. You see that most characterised in the film The Wind That Shakes the Barley by Ken Loach at the very end, when the two brothers are fighting and the older brother, who's joined the Free State Army, is talking to Cillian Murphy, the younger brother, who's the kind of the radical, and he's like, "What are you talking about? Distributing land and all this? You know, this is all nonsense." Like that's what it came down to. And Cumann na Gael was literally bankrolled by big farmers and bankers and industrialists. So of course they would never stand for that. And that's what it came down to: class interests, and our class interests lost.
Yeah.
Bummer.
So just
Sorry.
A quick thing. So when you were talking about, obviously we're all familiar with what happened to Connolly in the end and the way that he was brutally executed by the British state. But do you think that was kind of, they did that in a kind of a symbolic way to kind of break that tie between socialism and the Irish Republican movement, or was that kind of just the way it was done because he'd committed that uprising?
Yes, 100%. If you look at, so the Irish paper, the Irish Independent, was run by William Martin Murphy in 1913, 1916. And William Martin Murphy was one of the largest employers in Dublin. And when the Irish Independent commented on the leaders of the 1916 Rising, the comment was, you have to execute this guy. He's the most dangerous. He's the most volatile. Like, go for him especially. Funny side story. Arnott's, the store in Dublin city centre opposite Unite's office on Middle Abbey Street, actually gave the Irish Citizens Army their uniforms because the owners of Arnott's was a rival of William Martin Murphy's newspaper. So he thought it would be a kind of like an interesting way to try to bring down William Martin Murphy by arming the Irish Citizens Army. But yeah, absolutely. I think they were fully conscious of the fact that he was one of the key links, if not the key link, between the social movement and the Republican movement. And it's worth considering that the 1916 Rising happened because of Connolly, because the Irish Citizens Army effectively set the date for the Rising, and the Irish Republican Brotherhood approached him. This is in all his biographies, by the way, by Desmond Greaves, by Ruan O'Donnell. And Connolly vanished for 3 days. And he vanished because they didn't abduct him. He essentially sat for 3 days with the leaders of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and they conspired to launch the Rising. And the ultimatum that was put, apparently, was that it would happen in Easter or it wouldn't happen at all. And that was spurned on by Connolly. So the Rising happened because of Connolly, and the Irish Republican Brotherhood jumped on board. And you'll find that in the Irish War of Independence, the Irish Republican Brotherhood are, again, the key conspirators, the key leaders of the entire movement, which is kind of fascinating. Like, people like Michael Collins were on the Supreme Military Council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. So it's all to do with them. But unfortunately, they're not socialists, so it doesn't really, like, the question of independence is a bit more of a broad concept, political independence of the institutions, not economic or social or cultural.
So yeah, so there was the War of Independence, and then there was the Black and Tans. I think are one of the Churchill set them up. He was a good guy.
Boo! Fuck the Black and
not only the
Tans.
Bengal famine, but also he set up just this group of lads who had just come back from the war, World War One, and he said, "Go do whatever the hell you want to."
God, I hate
He
them.
burned down dozens of towns across the country, these Black and Tans, and they were a brutal bunch of feckers. And this was just part of just this. There was this terror among the British ruling class of what had happened in Russia, of a socialist revolution, of what the Soviets, like the Limerick Soviet, represented. There was just this terror that that's going to happen.
And how awesome it would be.
I mean, I think like going back to like the point on like education on that as well. So from where I was taught when I was in school is that the black and tans were the good guys. In Hong Kong.
joke.
No, genuinely. They taught us that the black and tans went in
Get
to
outta
like, kind
here.
of keep the peace and make sure everything was going steady.
Jesus.
And then I come out a couple of years down the line and like that's bullshit.
Have you ever gone to
I didn't know
a
that.
bar and ordered a black and tan?
I don't know what that is.
Oh.
So,
Do you know about that?
It's not a fucking thing.
Every St. Patrick's Day, I have to
it's
give
just one of the
lectures to people
Yeah,
about why they don't order
It's just
black
one of
and
the things that
tan.
Americans have just invented.
Yeah,
and,
like I've worked in loads of bars and I've been asked to make a Belfast car bomb.
Oh,
Oh, it's an Irish
yeah.
car bomb in
Fuck off to
America.
the pub. Like,
Yeah.
go.
But black and tans are like a half and half.
Yeah.
That's what it is. But every time on St. Patrick's Day, if I'm out and someone orders it, I yell at them and give them a lecture on why you don't order it. And they're like, it's 100 years ago. It doesn't matter. It's like, fuck off. It matters.
Yeah. So
I can't believe that they told you they're
That's
the
so
good
fucked up.
guys.
Well, they
no,
said
no.
the same about the British soldiers who come in
Yeah.
to Derry in the late 60s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah,
no, they taught us
yeah.
that. They
And
taught
that's
us
the- that's the
everything.
narrative that's-
Every kind of offensive campaign that the British had against
Is that
Ireland.
the Battle of the Box?
In school, we were taught.
Well,
part of that.
Yeah, they
yeah.
sent the soldiers in after.
We were taught 100%. The British were just doing what they had to do, and
Just following orders.
yeah, and it was our land, so it was our right to like.
Jesus,
But like, why? Why are we taught that?
In
It
It's
upholds,
completely
Could
baffling.
you clarify
it
a
upholds
story,
that idea that you were right the whole time. Like,
Yeah, it's still a material interest to the British state as well, you know,
Yeah.
to keep Northern Ireland, to keep Ireland as still very much economically dependent on Britain, you know, and
Yeah.
it's still, they still have an
Like,
empire,
do you-
you know, that's like...
Do you think that kind of system of education, obviously the Northern Ireland has very similar to what we have in kind of the in Britain? Do you think that's kind of a thing of keeping control there, or that they need to teach these things this way so they can keep the North?
Of course it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough, yeah.
Could you clarify a thing for me that I was told by I can't remember even who it was, but about the black and tans, that one time there was a Gaelic football match on, right?
Bloody
Yeah,
Sunday.
Bloody
Um,
Sunday.
Yeah, and they
Yeah.
turned up and shot the crowd
Yeah.
and everything.
There was an organisation known as the Squad. It was Michael Collins' kind of elite group of soldiers, and in Dublin, they carried out a number of assassinations against British officials.
dope.
Yeah, it was a good time. And then in reprisal,
Oh, yeah.
they went in. Was it Croke Park?
Park,
Yeah,
Croke
Croke
Park,
Park.
Yeah.
And they just went in there and just shot. There was a football game, a Gaelic football match going on, and they just shot like into the
Yeah.
crowd indiscriminately. How many people was it? Like
On
a dozen or
if
something?
if you knew what they taught me about Bloody Sunday in my nice little Cheshire high school, that
Yeah, I don't want to know.
No, it's
Yeah.
not good.
But again, that's something that has then reoccurred throughout every British colonial outpost against guerrilla warfare.
Mhm.
You can't find the insurgents. You can't target them. You can't single them out. So you have to punish the whole entire population.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean they
Because
taught,
then it makes the entire population turn against
Yeah, yeah,
those
of course,
people.
It's
that-
fundamentals of insurgency.
I mean they taught us that on Bloody Sunday that the Irish were the like not necessarily they were the aggressors, but that they started it and that they were kind of put down.
Well, Bloody Sunday in Derry in 1972 when they shot 14
That's a different Bloody
protesters.
Sunday.
Yeah, they shot 14 civil
Exactly,
rights
it's what-
Wait,
protesters.
there's more than one of
Yeah.
Yeah, there's-
Yeah.
Yeah, there's more than one atrocity committed.
No, I know, but that specific
It's
like
pretty
Bloody
shocking.
Sunday is. I thought it was just one of
There's two
them.
different Bloody Sundays.
Two
There's
Yeah,
one,
yeah.
One during the War of
Jesus
Independence, yeah.
Right.
the so-called War of Independence, and then one during the Troubles in 1970.
Yeah, so the Troubles
That's
is the one that we were
that
taught,
you
and
two
then
had
they
to
just
talk
completely
about.
Oh,
brushed over the other ones.
Yeah, but the thing is, even sans the education system, I can go into a bookshop in any town in England and find glowing autobiographies or biography stories about Churchill, about how great he was and he was a fantastic leader. And even
He's on the fucking
He was voted as the best
nerd.
Briton
exactly, he
in
was
history,
voted the
wasn't
best.
he?
He
Yeah.
is the fucking
Even though he's one of the worst humans
worst.
who's ever existed.
Yeah.
I
He
mean,
is an anti-Semitic, racist piece of shit.
all you have to do is look at like when the YCL marched against the Tory conference this year, and you had fucking dickheads in the shirts supporting like war criminals from Ireland, and like they're everywhere on every street corner. We support Soldier F, or we support blah 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 blah. It's just fucking ridiculous. Like,
Well, yeah, but it's the people who were there at Bloody Sunday have been fighting for decades for justice. For that, the original, the whole way the media operated in the north at the time was the BBC would take the army report as gospel.
Yeah.
And the army pushed the narrative that the IRA were within the ranks of the protesters and that they pulled guns first.
I mean, that's still kind of what's pushed now, isn't it? It's that, like,
Yeah, well,
Yeah, that's what they
well,
do in America with the pigs. They always take the pig side first, and they never report what actually happened. Because why would they do that? Because it doesn't uphold that narrative of, you know.
I think it was only in 2010 or 2011 Cameron admitted. I can't remember the name of the Savile report. I think it was called. They admitted that the British Army fired on the protesters completely unprovoked.
that was 2000.
But now they're trying to bastardise it to try and protect these soldiers that served the British Empire.
I mean, it's like the way that they won't name them. Like they committed what is pretty like undeniably a war crime. They won't give their names. They're protecting these people.
We're just the worst, aren't we?
Well, it's sorry.
Well, I think America has you beat.
And it's something that Boris Johnson's new government's going to push as far as it can. They're looking to completely free the soldiers in the north of any legal implications for their actions.
Yeah. Sort of continuing on this weird tangent we're going on about the Troubles, even though it sort of wasn't coming up as a subject yet, is that when it comes to the way we're taught about it, it's very much sort of lying by omission. We're not taught about any of the bad shit we've done. We're only taught that the IRA were terrible, they planted car bombs and bombed Manchester and tried to kill Thatcher, which is pretty fucking wicked. Killing Thatcher, mostly.
I live in Manchester.
Well, they're trying
The post box that the IRA put the bomb in is still there. But like,
Do you know that the bombing of Manchester City Centre in 1986 is like cited as the sole reason it's like economically performed?
Yeah, no, there is a lot of members of the CP. I shouldn't say this, but there is a lot of members who are not in the CP at all in Manchester who are like, yeah, the 1996 bombing was the best thing that ever happened to the Manchester. Because at least the under got fucking renovated. It's like
So 1920-21, so-called War of Independence. There's the Black and Tans, which are totally attack the populace. And there's a massive, like with the Soviets, there's a working class element of it too that's rising amid this national revolution that has a more of a social element involved with it. And essentially, the Brits come to the table as quick as they can, and they talk to the representatives of the movement, and they, not as quick as they can, they try to crush it. And then once they realise that they can't this time, that this isn't all that, this is the vast majority of the populace is on board with the national liberation, they come to the table and they give an absolutely horrendous treaty that eventually keeps capitalism, keeps the allegiance to the king, keeps things very much as they are, but with, a road to kind of a republic. It's not even a republic at this point. It's known as the Irish Free State. Total nonsense term.
It's completely bound to the British state. If you read the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which also doubles up as a constitution, members of the Irish Parliament have to take an oath of allegiance to the crown. So it's essentially a Commonwealth country and totally bound to the interests of the British state. There's British ports in Ireland. There's reparation payments from Ireland to Britain, believe it or not.
No! No, that's the same kind of
compensation.
shit.
Yeah, so
That's the same kind of shit that the French did to Burkina Faso. I fucking hate that.
So the way the treaty's written is quite pro-British. The terms are issued on the Irish, and I guess that's really the main point of contention in the Civil War, is that the people who are a bit more Republican and a bit more socially minded look at it and go, well, this isn't what we can fought for. This isn't a republic, and de facto it isn't a republic. It's still a colony.
I mean, you'll never guess how that's taught in Britain. That was when we were taught that the British completely freed the Irish and that they were then free to go.
It's a lot of crap.
The Republic wasn't even declared until 1949.
Yeah.
27.
Do you still have to pay?
Was it
Do you have to
49,
still pay
It was
reparations?
49.
I actually don't know. But
The Constitution.
The Constitution was changed in 37. Yeah.
oh,
By Del Era, and then the Republic was declared.
Okay.
in
Yeah.
49.
Do you still have to pay?
No, there was
I think an economic war.
Yeah, there was an economic war when Eamon de Valera and Fianna Fáil took over.
Okay.
And there was kind of an agreement made, but up until that time, Cumann na Gael and the Labour Party had organised a method of paying Britain payments for
Mental.
independence. Yeah.
Oh
And,
my fucking god.
Well, basically, the treaty was a way that they could get a section, like you get basically the Irish capitalist class, who, war isn't that great for business. They were happy enough with the arrangements of the treaty, and a large portion of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, and other people to take their weapons and fight for them, essentially, and eventually they would win out in the war. The brutal civil war. And there's so many war atrocities committed Irish people against Irish people in that, and that eventually led to the foundation of the state that we pretty much have today, which was just this the island cut in half. That was part of the treaty. Part of that came from there was a militant unionist movement up in the north that signed in 1914. Even when there was home rule, they signed the solemn league and covenant where they would say that if there was any home rule, which was even just giving a parliament to Ireland, we will just cause havoc, is what they said. And that's still kind of used as a stick against the Republican movement to say, oh, what about the unionists?
The British knew about all the gun running the unions were doing at the time and turned a blind eye to it.
Yeah.
It's another way they could cement division.
Yeah. And so basically what we got out of our War of Independence was just this split in half of Ireland. What Connolly said, he obviously died before petition was signed, but he saw it was already on the table as a political potential, and he said that it would be a carnival of reaction. In the north, there would be a unionist state that was extraordinarily reactionary. They still have that today. They barely have democracy, even in the capitalist sense. And they don't really. Down the south, it was this extraordinarily Catholic state. And I think it kind of, Lenin's theory of the state kind of, I think, illuminates this, in that the capitalist class wasn't really strong enough. The Irish capitalist class, there wasn't really much of one. There wasn't one there to take over the reins of state, to run it themselves. So they became very dependent on the Catholic Church to kind of run the state, to hold up the institutions of power, to enforce their authority. The Archbishop of Quaid, I think he was the Archbishop of Dublin, he ratified the Constitution, and went through him. Whenever De Valera was writing it up, it had to go through the Catholic Church for their approval first. And there we just had what I would term a fascistic state, which was just like Franco's state in Spain, which was very beholden to Catholicism. It was very similar here in Ireland, where Catholicism, people were brainwashed into Catholicism. It was it was just the mantra of everybody. And it was very much a way of keeping the state intact and the populace in place, was that we're all Catholics here. There's a union of classes, which is very fascistic language, where we're all Catholics, we're all God's holy people, whatever. And some of the atrocities, which really the Irish state still has not owned up to, like the Magdalen laundries, where women who transgressed from what a good Catholic woman is supposed to do, where they if they had sex outside of marriage, if they were raped, if they were pregnant outside of marriage, anything, they could be sent off to these laundries. And thousands of them were, or mother and babies homes, where they were forced to work, where they were forced to just vegetate there. And there's still mass graves were found just a few years ago of thousands of infants and mothers. And that's what our independent state was, in quotation marks.
Sorry, what's a laundry? Just so
sorry.
you can explain.
Well, they were known as the Magdalen laundries, is what they were known as. They were all ran by the Catholic Church, and they went back to the 19th century, where they were kind of seen as a place for poor women to go to. But
Is it like a workhouse, sort of?
Yeah.
Okay.
A permanent workhouse.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what's curious, by the way, is that there's newspaper clippings from the time of the Magdalen laundries that actually outlined that other laundrettes were run out of business because the Magdalen laundries were so highly profitable. So obviously the women didn't get any wages.
So they were sort of like private prisons.
Totally.
Yeah,
Like what you
Okay.
have in the States,
Okay.
yeah.
Absolutely. They
Okay.
were.
Yeah, very
And
similar.
It's also worth pointing out, like, some of the early stuff in the post-independent state, like there was a mini famine in Ireland in the new Free State in 1925.
Only the Soviet Union reported on it of any country in the world.
And actually, only the Soviet Union recognised the newly declared Irish Republic in 1919. But anyway, that's a immaterial, I suppose.
It's very important.
Like the state that had been born was basically no different to the British administration, and in many ways, it was probably even worse. You have things like the destruction of local democracy, for example. Today, you have 32 local county councils. During British rule, you had over 600. So it's quite fascinating that part of British rule required such a micromanagement of local society. But ironically enough, it actually gave local people an input into how their town was managed through urban councils. And one of the things the Free State did was get rid of them and destroy them. But beyond the Magdalen laundries, the children's homes, the mass graves of children,
the institutionalized sex abuse, child sex abuse, there was thousands and thousands of cases. That the Carrigan report, I think in 1929 or 30, where it came out, there was a report that said there was enormous amounts of child sex abuse going on through the church.
The Catholic Church?
Yeah, the Catholic Church.
And
and it was just written off as said, the state just said, they just brushed it under the rug, you know?
The
And that
state
went
always
up into today. You know?
Yeah, it's still happening.
Yeah. When the Tuam babies were found, so Tuam is like a town in Galway, and an amateur historian accidentally stumbled upon a mass grave in septic tanks of 800 child corpses, and there are inspectorate reports from who is it, like, not social workers, I think it might be Garda detectives, who talk about making a trip out there. They knew from the first day what was actually happening in these homes. They knew what was happening, who was dying, how they were being treated, that children weren't being fed properly, that they were malnourished or whatever. They knew all along, and they simply didn't care. So that was kind of the Ireland of then. I think, like, the other side point of this is that, you know, we talk about McCarthyism in the United States. McCarthyism in Ireland existed probably from the fucking day Connolly died, and it accelerated even more aggressively because there was a Communist Party in Ireland. It was tiny. It was aligned to the left Republican movement, many of which were members of the IRA, and it had to be decimated and destroyed, and it was quite successfully.
And that's what the Irish Free State also saw, that what the Soviets represented, what the trade unions represented, that terrified them just as it terrified the British ruling class, and so they just crushed it. They crushed the working class movement. They crushed the trade unions. They crushed the communist movement. Communism was from the pulpit was decried as this godless, terrible ideology that wanted to kill everybody, and it was just propagandized against heavily. It was very much an anti-working class state. One of the first things they did is it imposed austerity. They just, that's the same shit they're doing today,
Yeah.
I guess I could just make one more point though about that. As like the Irish state has been able to kind of deal with a kind of a de-Catholicization in the last couple of decades, and it's now moved to the EU and foreign investment capital as its kind of the way to hold up the power of the state.
Yeah.
And now we just have a country that is just being systematically sold from under us, and rents are rising, cost of living is rising, particularly since 2008 crisis. Ireland was forced to take on, 47% of Europe's banking debt was put on Ireland.
Why?
Because they debt trapped us. They made it that they gave us enormous amounts of loans, and then the Irish state was locked in, and they are just our ringmasters, essentially.
I think it's slight correction. They didn't give us enormous amount of debts. They gave the debts to private speculators and bankers and vulture funds.
That's true.
Who took the credit, and then what the state did was, and what the role of a state and capitalist society is to take on the private debt of, like, I think 70 billion of debt was accumulated by 182 individuals, and to transfer it to the public. And that's what they did, and they did it successfully.
Very upsetting.
Yeah.
And they did it very successfully.
Yeah.
So
I think that it's at the height of the Celtic Tiger, I think the Anglo-Irish Bank had something like debt, which was 400% of Ireland's GDP as a whole.
Jesus.
Oh my
Yeah.
god.
And they done the same to Portugal and Greece and Spain as well.
Yeah.
And what resulted was 25% youth unemployment. And all those countries now have grown communist youth organisations.
What is youth unemployment in Ireland?
Actually, don't.
I can tell.
Well, according to the labour statistics, we have full employment, but it's kind of like full employment in the United States in the sense that everybody has a part-time job with 0-hour contracts. So it's very actually difficult to ascertain what the real employment statistics are.
Yeah.
Well,
It's working 5 hours a week.
It's all precarious. Like it's not-
Exactly. So it's not really like secure full-time employment.
with American unemployment rates, you have like 3 months of unemployment. That's when you count towards that unemployment rate. And after you've hit that 3 months, then you drop off that statistic. So then you don't even exist. So our unemployment rate could be way higher than it actually is because it's so hard to get a job.
I just looked it up there, and in 2018, it's estimated youth unemployment in Ireland was at 13.49%.
Jeez.
Yeah, so ever since the crash, it's been a decade really now, and there's just a whole generation just lost. There's been no social progress at all.
Yeah, we're all fucked.
Yeah.
How was Ireland affected by the crash in 2008? I mean, I imagine it wasn't good. Like,
Well, no, that's why austerity was implemented in the first place.
yeah.
Because if the state takes on the private debt of all the banks, then they have to make up for it somewhere. So essentially, austerity, cutting all social services, cutting all welfare spending, is to make up for the money they've given the banks to keep the banks liquid.
Yeah.
So austerity, there's no end in sight. It's permanent.
Yeah, it's like Marx says in Capital that the only part of the national wealth that the proletariat owns is the national debt, and that is like what the Irish people own is just that.
Yeah, that's all wrapped up in.
Do you think when that kind of debt's like pushed through and paid off that they'll just continue with the
That'll never
austerity
be
That
anyway?
debt
Well,
is
no,
never
it
going to
can't
be
be paid
paid
off,
up.
Yeah, and that's
It's just
one of
perpetual.
the central arguments the Communist Party, and only the Communist Party, made in 2008, 2009 was that repudiate the debt. And what that slogan meant was essentially is that the debt's not ours. Working class people shouldn't pay it. Full stop. It's not a question of how do we repay it, how long does it. We don't repay it at all. So it was it was a visionary statement for its time, and unfortunately, my only criticism is that it didn't like get the traction that it deserved to get. But as a central thesis, that it doesn't belong to us, and that it's been a socialized debt. It shouldn't have been socialized, but it was. And what austerity is the transfer of wealth from the working class to the ruling class. Since 2008 to now, what we've had is a wave of the defunding of all public services, mass emigration, suicide, precarious work, the explosion of the gig economy, but that's happened in all Western countries. The platform gig economy, which has only served really to fuel precarious employment. I would say deindustrialization of whatever was fucking left. Deunionization. We have the lowest union density ever in Irish history. I would also say depoliticization, because most people, or quite a lot of people, they don't even vote. Never mind engaging with other political activism. They don't even vote because they don't give a shit, because they realize that the mechanics and the balance of political power in the institutions that we have don't actually impact them. Casting your ballot doesn't change the balance of power. And I suppose that's really where the CYM comes in many ways for young people, is that our argument isn't we're going to empower you to go vote for X, Y, and Z. Our argument is we're going to politicize you, educate you, and at some stage in this journey of political education, we're all going to get fucking armed and overthrow the state. That's the goal for young people, to reach a critical mass.
Sorry.
An amount of people, and to offer that alternative. In the meantime, we'll fight short-term battles that we can kind of win and improve our lives somewhat and improve the lives of our loved ones.
It's the ballot or the bullet.
As Malcolm X said.
Yeah, it's always the bullet that's going to win.
So, as you mentioned before, Connolly said there would be a carnival of reaction with the unionist northern state, a Protestant state for a Protestant people, as it was called, and then you would have the southern state, which of course ideologically commanded by the Catholic Church, and with the political class being essentially the middle managers for British and later EU imperialism and American imperialism. I'm finance capital in Ireland, but you also touched on how in colonial societies you have to have the idea of a threat to sort of cement your own rule, and it's something that unionism has had to do to sustain itself for nearly 100 years. Firstly, the external threats of the 26 county state, which ironically the unionist leaders at the time themselves asked for home rule, which created the 26 county state, and then the internal threats of the Catholic people. And then later with the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, that itself was seen as a huge threat to the very existence of the Orange State as well. So from its inception, it had to be highly militarized, highly repressive on one section of the community. And this, as I mentioned before, was done through the Special Powers Act. I can read out some of the things that that legislation brought with it. And you said before, liberal democracy never came to Ireland until way later on. So the Orange State in itself was quasi-fascist, I would say. So the Special Powers Act included you're allowed to be arrested without a warrant, imprisonment without charge or trial and without recourse, or a court of law, enter in search of homes without a warrant and with force any hour of the day or night, declare a curfew and prohibit meetings and assemblies, permit punishment by flogging, denial claim to a trial by jury, do any act involving interference with the rights of private property is another one. And
When was that?
so the Special Powers Act was in force from the very inception of the Orange State. And
Is it still in force?
no, today
Okay.
that would be replaced with like the Terrorism Act
Okay.
and that sort of thing, which is
probably not any different.
which is the European Court of Human Rights, I think, have said is a violation of human rights in itself.
Wasn't there a thing like last week where they found that the British courts ruled that our military intelligence could do pretty much whatever they wanted
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Northern
yeah.
Ireland, and that there would be no repercussions from it.
It was basically that MI5 could basically kidnap whoever the fuck they wanted and face absolutely no issue from the British government for it.
So there was an instance of that happening. It's pretty famous, and they're still seeking justice. It was they're known as the hooded men. So during internment, which was another policy the British government introduced in the north at the time. So if they suspected you of being in the IRA, they suspected you of any sort of political dissidence, they could just put you in jail without any trial at all. What they did was they took some of these men, put hoods over them, flew them out to an army base on the north coast, and I think for 7 days or 14 days or something, they kept them there in a boiler suit. They had to eat, sleep, shit in the boiler suit. They were deprived of sleep. They were made stand in stress positions for hours on end, beaten.
So they were just tortured.
And
Yeah.
when was this? Sorry,
This would have been in the early 70s.
Jeez.
And there's a good interview by Brendan Hughes, who was a commander of the D Company Provisional IRA, on YouTube, where he describes his own interrogation. So they would have put a gun in your mouth, pulled the trigger. It would have been empty.
I mean, who was in government like British government at this time? Was that
Well, initially it was the Labour Party. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was 70s is all Labour.
Yeah, it wasn't until 79 when Thatcher came in.
Yeah.
But we can go into that again. So yeah, they done other things. So they would have pretended to throw you out of a helicopter. They would have done all sorts of things. And today, this is not seen as torture. It's not ruled by British courts as torture. No.
Of course it's not.
America does a bunch of shit that
I mean, yeah, but we expect it from Americans.
we learn from you guys, though.
Yeah, Yanks are better at being Brits than Brits are, which is the whole reason.
Don't
No,
do me
it's
like that.
Go on.
Good question.
Oh, so I was going to ask regarding the sort of mass detention thing. If you were suspected of being in the IRA,
Yeah.
wasn't that one of the things that led to the Ballymurphy massacre? Because I heard that was caused, or what happened there was, I think it was some families were protesting against it when the British decided to just fucking open fire on them.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting to note that the battalion, the parachute regiment, which done the Ballymurphy massacre, also done Bloody Sunday. So Ballymurphy massacre was 1971, I think, and Belfast at the time was sort of the epicentre for most of the trouble in the north. So they moved them to Derry.
So like a lot of that was the same men, like.
Oh, it's the exact same unit.
From what I've heard about the
Jesus
Paras
Christ.
in Belfast, or in Northern Ireland in general, they were all just a bunch of wankers, really.
So they
Or just
moved
the
they
British
moved
in
from
general.
killing one group of innocent Irish people to killing another group of innocent Irish people. Jeez.
And a lot of these families are still seeking justice.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
British state will never realise the atrocities that they've done.
Because I think Soldier F was in, or the one that all the British people have the profile photos on Facebook.
Yeah.
That's
They're
what
all
I
like,
mentioned
I
before.
stand with Soldier F, which
When
makes me
And
angry
he's
beyond
just a
belief.
murderer.
when we were talking
Um,
about like the YCL on the March Against the Tory conference, that was what was on the T-shirts. That was I stand with Soldier F.
I think
And
Soldier
I-
F was involved. I think it was Ballymurphy. It might be another one. I could be
I
wrong.
think it was Ballymurphy. I'm not too sure. It was one of the two.
Yeah.
I can't recall. But there is a theory that Bloody Sunday. So, if you look at the civil rights movement, only came about because in the north at the time, the Protestant working class essentially got a dividend for supporting the Union with Britain. So they had marginal better access to jobs. Housing was the main one, and public office as well. But this is in the context of industrial Britain. So this sectarianism was state sponsored by the North and backed by Britain, of course. So you had a structural sectarianism as well. So they would the state would sponsor factories in certain areas where there was an overwhelmingly Protestant majority. So in Belfast at the time, Ballymena, Larne, County Down, and County Antrim, the same places which were planted. And there was less state-sponsored industry to the northwest and to the west, so Derry and Fermanagh as well. Infrastructure links to the northwest were ignored. There's still no direct train route from Belfast to Derry. There's no express train. You can only get a bus. Another thing which flared tensions at the time was the Unionist government's decision to place a new university, Ulster University, in Coleraine instead of in Derry. So Derry would be the second largest city in the north. They decided to place the new university in Coleraine, which is a Protestant town, maybe 15 miles east of Derry itself, which caused uproar from civil rights protesters as well. So the Protestant working class were essentially paid a dividend for supporting the Union. And there was no one man, one vote. Voting was allocated based on housing. So if you had a social house or you owned property, you were entitled to a vote. So naturally, Catholics, less access to social housing, shitter housing in general. And if you can control where people live and how they live, then you can then gerrymander the constituencies. So the best example would be in Derry as well, which is an overwhelmingly Catholic city, with nationalist and Republican sympathies, and it had 3 wards in its local city council. There was the North Ward, the South Ward, and the Waterside. So they penned all the Catholics into the South Ward, which would be now the Bogside and Corrigan, and that sort of thing. So they penned them into shitty social housing in the South Ward. Massive population density of Catholics in that area. And then the North Ward and the Waterside would then be more sparsely populated and better social housing. So they were essentially able to gerrymander the way into a unionist majority in a city where that just didn't exist. So they had 2 wards which were controlled by the unionist party. So these communities have been through structural sectarianism have been systematically wore down, and then bring into account after the formation of the state in 1920, there was massive pogroms against Catholic people in workplaces. In 1919, just before the North itself was created, there was an engineer strike in the shipyard, which was both Catholic and Protestant workers, and it led to a citywide general strike in Belfast. A lot of the Protestants who supported the strike, a lot of the Protestant trade unionists removed them from their jobs, and the Catholics removed them from their jobs, and then through the creation of the Northern State entrenched this idea of like the Protestant working class were superior to Catholics. And then you get like the Catholics are like subhuman and they're dirty and they breed like rabbits. You get that sort of as we touched on before. Paisley's view. Yes.
This might be a really like obvious question, but has the kind of this become a kind of at least from kind of the outside perspective, a conflict between Protestants and Catholics? Because it seems like on a lot of this stuff, Protestants supported the Republican stuff, like each step of the strikes. But then obviously they were all moved out, and then
because a lot of the Protestant working class gained economic benefit from the Union, whereas there was no. A lot of the Catholic working class had no stake in that society at all. So the partition of Ireland isn't just a geographical divide. The partition of Ireland is really a division of 2 communities in the north. That's how I would say it. I wouldn't really see it as although it is geographical. That's not why it was done.
Is it more a split between those 2 groups of Protestants and Catholics, or is it more like kind of?
Well, no, it's not. It's not. The divide isn't based on if you believe in transubstantiation or whether
It's
whether
more class-based,
it's
right?
it's not even class based. Not anymore. It's tribal and in relation to the national question.
Is it kind of like that it's become so entrenched kind of socially that that's just the side that you fall on at this point? Or is that kind of not?
For younger, then yes, but that's in the context of the Orange State,
Right.
which Diary then smashed. In the post Good Friday Agreement, 1998 state, there was the promise of the end of sectarianism and the peace dividend. We're going to get an investment in our public services, because we've brokered peace, and a lot of young people, because of that's been the prevailing ideology from the political class in the north. A lot of young people don't buy into the narrative of nationalists and unionists. That's why you've seen the rise of the Alliance Party, and the successes of People Before Profit in Belfast as well, which aren't overtly nationalist in their outlook. They're definitely more a class-based politics, even if they are Trotskyist.
I'm sorry, so obviously bourgeois politics is bollocks, right? But
Well, hold it there.
in most capacities. But obviously, was it Belfast South that recently, after 120 years of being unionist, went nationalist?
North Belfast.
No, sorry, North Belfast. Is there a change in sort of political consciousness in Northern Ireland, do you think? Recently?
Well, there's more nationalist MPs now than unionist MPs, but for what?
yeah.
For what? I mean, Sinn Féin have had an electoral decline in terms of voter turnout in their last 3 elections now in the north. Which is why they're now very keen to get Stormont back up and running.
Yeah.
Because now they can capitalise on their election results, whereas before they had no interest of going back into Stormont.
I feel like another part of the reason why sort of there is a nationalist majority in Northern Ireland for the first time ever is a lot of it is to do with how Northern Ireland voted in the EU referendum as well, because obviously a lot of Liberals are pretty fucking desperate to stay in the EU, and I remember hearing something the other day about how the number of Irish passport applications has skyrocketed.
90,000 from the north.
I think
Yeah.
Ian Paisley's Junior's family all have Irish passports.
Really? If it was 90,000 from the north, how many
Yeah.
people are there in Northern Ireland?
90,000.
1.9 million or
I
something
think
like
there's
that.
also like a fairly silly amount of English people with Irish grandparents or parents that all apply too.
Well, this is why Sinn Féin have geared their strategy towards Brexit in the way they have, because up until the referendum they were Eurosceptic. They don't believe in the EU.
Yeah, because
But-
Northern Ireland voted fairly unanimously to remain for the most part.
because it would exacerbate the issues of partition in Ireland. It would expose the border counties to like economic devastation that they haven't seen before. And the new state, the cross-sectarian state after 1998, has been upheld by a lot of EU funding as well.
Yeah.
So the North is an economic basket case.
Yeah.
It's heavily reliant on foreign direct investment and grants.
Deindustrialised
Yeah.
massively over the last few decades.
Yeah, and heavily reliant on EU funding.
Yeah, it's fair to say as well that big house unionism as a concept is probably in a bit of a crisis. Not just because of its leave position, but also because just like Sinn Féin, it's facilitated austerity on the community it claims to represent, and the support for it is dwindling. Like, we have members who joined the Connolly Youth Movement from those communities that would be traditionally virulently anti-communist, and they're like, "This is a load of bollocks." You know, it doesn't add up for me to retain the views that I'm being taught by my family members, because they're in total contradiction to what my reality is, and my reality is precarious pay, high rent, zero chances of actually a decent life, the necessity to migrate. So I don't think young people are stupid either, and with the advent of the internet, it's going to pierce that bubble that's existed in communities in the north that might never have been pierced in the past.
Yeah.
Sorry, this can be cut though. I'm just curious. Is People Before Profit, are they Leave or Remain? Because I don't know Truss.
They voted for Leave and picked up a lot of stick for it in West Belfast, which would be like Sinn Féin's strongest seat.
Right. Okay.
They're an SWP front.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah, we're going back to deindustrialisation. I think the Protestant working class is a lot more scarred by deindustrialisation than the nationalist Catholic working class as well, because whereas before in the Orange State they were guaranteed a job, they were guaranteed housing because of the industrialisation and because of the export of all that labour intensive industry.
Yeah.
There's nothing there anymore to replace that, and you know what I mean, that a lot of young people growing up in them communities are very, very fucking angry.
Yeah.
Whereas Catholic working class people under the Orange State never had.
Yeah.
That was never a reality.
Yeah. So unionism was kind of like losing its material underpinning for like a section of the working class
Yeah.
to support it.
Yeah. Well, it's been gone ever since
Yeah.
the formation of the new state in 1998. So. Well, 1974 even, when it's important to realise that neoliberalism never came to the north until way later on, because of the conflict. So you still had the British state still had to support the north through like Keynesian policies all the way up until peace. Peace was brokered by Tony Blair and members of the US state, and ever since that, it's Belfast and the north has been a neoliberal paradise essentially. So universal credit, public services slashed, great tax regimes for the fire companies who want to come in, so finance, insurance, retail, they're the only jobs available, and it's all call centre work.
Like the south,
Yeah. So the northern and southern economies are more similar than the North would be to England or Scotland.
Yeah.
Because they're both economically scarred by partition. So a call centre will come in, American company, get a really favourable tax regime, employ a load of people, and then just fuck off like 3 or 4 years later. The North has no sustainable economic plan while it's under British rule. Because the North has lost. There's no reason for the British capitalist class to support it anymore.
Yeah.
It's not the industrial. Belfast isn't the industrial city it was in 1920.
So what do you see like the future of Northern Ireland being?
I think, well, a lot of the legal people and advisors in around Sinn Féin are pushing for a border poll by May 2023. I don't know if it will be as soon as that, but there will be a border poll on the constitutional position of the North. And I would vote yes, obviously, even though that new state would be a 32 county state under the auspices of, under the yoke of EU imperialism instead of British imperialism, which is essentially what the whole border thing in the North is about. It's just a battle between the EU and the British for who can control the North.
But once you get rid of that partition, then you can focus on your own state. Like once you get rid of British imperial rule, then you can get rid of EU imperial rule and then focus on
building global communism.
Yeah, but there's some who would disagree and say, well, I don't want to join the South if it means our standard of living is going to have to drop to theirs. So in the South, there's a more privatised.
It sounds like their standard of living is basically the same.
Yeah.
And it's just shit. It's shit for everybody.
The one
now.
argument a lot of people on the left would use would be, well, the North has the NHS. And the
So
South.
why not bring the
South doesn't.
NHS?
Exactly.
Bring it down there.
Exactly.
Do you not have socialised healthcare in the South?
It's
It's
weird, like-
it's like a 3-tier system where the public healthcare system actually picks up for people with private medical insurance, and if you want to go to accident and emergency, I think it's €100 now, not 50 on the spot. I don't know if you don't have it; they probably mail it out to you. But I've paid £100 before, so
I can't.
So it's not free, like.
$300.
yeah. Yeah, so they're definitely changing it, and the funny thing is like the public purse picks up for people who have private medical insurance. So if you have private insurance, you'll go into a publicly funded hospital, and the only difference is they'll see you first because you have private insurance. So the reality is that we subsidise people who have private insurance, and they make all the profit on it.
So I kind of assumed the Irish, the Republic of Ireland already had socialised healthcare, but if that's not the case.
Yeah, it's not the worst in the world, but it's definitely being transformed. It's being Americanized.
Yeah.
100%. It's definitely heading that direction.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah.
and the NHS in the North will be the first to go.
Yeah.
I mean, the NHS.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, all you have to do is look at spending per capita in the North compared to England.
How much does the North get comparatively compared to?
Well, first of all, the Stormont has no control over fiscal policy. You receive a block grant
Really?
from
Do they
Westminster.
not have any kind
No.
of? You don't get.
It's completely undemocratic arrangement, and it's designed to fail.
What? So you just get like money, and then they get to decide how it's.
Yeah,
So what,
so
you
you get
get-
money, and
like-
the executive, who under the do hunt system, post Good Friday Agreement, it has to be a coalition or a partnership between a nationalist and unionist party. They take that money and essentially just carve it up between their own support base.
So Westminster tells Northern Ireland how much it gets, and they just have to make do.
Yeah. So essentially, the only way the political class, Sinn Féin, the DUP, can retain support from their people is putting that money into their own separate jurisdictions, and that's the only reason nationalists will still buy into that system.
Mm-hmm.
You know the whole DUP confidence and supply. They said they get £1 billion. What happened with that? Because because
I imagine it just lined the pockets.
It's not done. No, as far as I'm aware, no.
Right, okay.
It wouldn't be the first time the DUP's just sort of done nothing fucking constructive with money. They did a thing where they spent like £500 million pounds worth of money on just lining their friends' pockets There's some like renewable heat initiative
Yeah.
or whatever the fuck it is called.
Yeah, RHI, the RHI
Yeah.
scandal was one of the reasons Stormont collapsed 3 years ago.
Has it been that long?
Yeah, they've been like 3 years
So
without.
I
functioning
remember
local government.
Adam Murray came to talk to us about a year and a half ago about Stormont going like under, and it had been a year at that point.
But the do-hunt system of government and no control over your own fiscal policy, no control over your own spending, limited control over your own spending, no say in foreign relations of Britain to anywhere else. It's designed to fail.
So
It's designed to not work. It's
From
designed to be politically paralysed.
From that, for me, it sounds like even when Stormont's functioning, it's kind of just there to keep people kind of like, oh yeah, we've got our own little parliament, but it's not fully as effective as the Westminster government. You don't decide your own.
There's legislation Stormont can't pass on certain things.
So like you're completely like blocked by.
Yeah.
Jeez.
And also there's the petition of concern.
Yeah, I remember that. Like,
So if you have over 30 seats in Stormont, you can just veto anything.
Yeah, because the DUP
Isn't that how
used
they-
that a few years ago to block same-sex
yeah,
marriage.
isn't that how they kind of tried to block the whole like abortion thing and all that as well?
Yeah.
where they-
That's what they used. They used petition of concern to do it.
But now that they've got a non-functioning government, didn't same-sex marriage pass recently?
Yes.
Or something?
Yeah, but it's
In
under
Westminster.
but it's undergoing, and I know the abortion, it's undergoing a consultation process
Yeah.
now.
So can they overturn that?
If they
Not
form a
really.
government,
What they can do is it was supposed to be brought to parity with the laws in England, but there's a consultation process in which it can't be.
Right.
Essentially, if enough people say no, we don't want the same legislation as exists in England.
This might be kind of an obvious question, but when obviously the GFA was 97, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, 98. But how did that kind of affect that? Kind of their rights as political prisoners. Did that change again in?
Internment of Republicans still exists in the north.
Still?
Yeah, so
In the south as well.
yeah, so there was the Brits done away with internment later on. So internment was introduced in I think 1972, but by 1976 they had moved away from that and moved to a form of trial known as diplock courts. So you had to prove you were innocent instead of being proven you were guilty, and the state could just say whatever they wanted.
Is
So
that
it was
the
effective
opposite way
intern-
even the British legal system's supposed
Yeah,
to
exactly.
work? It's meant
Yeah,
to be
it's
innocent
in the-
until proven guilty, but they just flipped it and had to do with the Irish.
So internment effectively was still in existence, but under the guise of like liberal, wrapped up in like British liberal ideology.
I mean, I suppose it's more a question for Alex, but you just made reference to the fact that it's like a similar thing in the Republic as well. Like, how does that
In the
work?
south, what you have is the Offences Against the State Act, which was introduced in 1939. And during World War II, when the south went into an emergency period, they interned communists and republicans in the Curragh camp, military camp, for 5 years. And they did it under the auspices of the Offences Against the State Act. But the thing is that the Offences Against the State Act is still in force until today. So what the Offences Against the State Act does is it essentially targets things like organisations that are proscribed and that have an intention to overthrow the state. And more specifically, it establishes a special criminal court. And what the special criminal court does is prosecute individuals for like special crimes, with a focus again on political organisations. So most of the people who are imprisoned or judged by the special criminal court are actually of a political background, so people from Republican backgrounds more specifically. And the way the special criminal court works is that if a Garda superintendent, so like a senior Garda officer, verbally can testify that you're in a Republican organisation, you can actually be imprisoned without parole or without a jury, or without a release date. So it's a very like, it totally flies in the face of every single basic judicial concept of equality or fairness. There's no appeal, there's no parole, there's no jury. You're either convicted or you're not. And it happens often. You'll see it in the news. Now, the people who get convicted, whatever, are in different organisations. We might not agree with them, but nevertheless, it's a political court.
Yeah.
There's nothing criminal about it.
Mm-hmm.
The way the media, the way the police, the way the army dresses it up is that it's a court to deal with heavy gangland crime. But in reality, most of the convictions are actually for Republicans. There's a former Connolly Youth Movement member actually in prison right now. I believe he had explosives in the back of his car there not too long ago. No connection to any of our activity, but but he was convicted by the Special Criminal Court and he's still in prison.
I was about to ask, does that not like land on the CYM as well?
Not yet. The way the Special Criminal Court works and the way the Offences Against the State Act works is that the organisation has to be legal and prescribed. If the day comes that the CYM is declared an illegal organisation, then 100% that legislation will be used to hammer us.
There's
Not yet.
There's a really high profile case in the north of a man called Tony Taylor, who was interned and held over for 1,000 days without trial.
That's bananas.
That's not even legal under UK law though. It's like
That
Well, it doesn't matter if it's legal.
That's not
It's
legal
legal
under
enforcement.
U.S. law, but
I mean,
they make
it's-
exceptions.
it's our government who's doing it, so it's going to tell them no.
Yeah.
It's like,
We went wildly fucking off.
Yeah,
course.
we were on the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association.
Yeah.
It's worth
Yeah.
pointing out actually that the first General Secretary of the Connolly Youth Movement, Matt Davison, was very involved in the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, and what NICRA was a combination of militant Republicans, social activists, lefties
Liberal
in general,
unionists.
and even liberal unionists to fight for like this idea that Catholics should probably have the right to vote and have the right to the
It was
same
very inspired
access
by
as other
the
people.
African American civil rights movement in America.
Yeah,
very
there's a
much.
book I'm reading right now about Northern Ireland and the Black movement in America. That's really, really good.
Madge Davison, there's a famous photo of Madge Davison in the Free Dairy Museum, and she's on the back of a lorry, and it's on the day of Bloody Sunday, and she has a megaphone on the back of the lorry. It just like goes to show like how the CYM were involved in struggles at that time.
And like all these struggles are interconnected, which is why I'm doing an episode in Belfast about connecting Ireland and Palestine. But like Ireland always supported Palestine, supported South Africa, supported the civil rights movement for African Americans in America. Like all of these are connected, and to have that international struggle, like
Essentially, yeah. It's what
Really?
Connolly was so. If you read so many of his articles, the international struggle against imperialism is just on the forefront of his mind. And so many socialists today don't get what Connolly was. People who call themselves socialist Trotskyists.
those are anti-communist.
They'd say, "Oh, Connolly fucked up. You know, he shouldn't have done
Trotsky
1916."
fucked up.
We should have just taken over the whole world with socialism, man.
But what Connolly did in 1916 resonated around the world, like, you know,
Yeah.
and inspired other people to rise up against empire. And it was an objective, you know, blow to empire. So those international connections that they applied just for what the people in people like just working class people in the north trying to get better rights for themselves.
Yeah.
And that was met with, it's so easy to look at how violent a criminal they were. Ooh, scary. But it's like, where did that actually come from? And to look at the violence that they were met with when they were asking for equality in housing public housing treatment, equality in rents, equality in jobs. They were asking for the most basic civil rights for themselves. And January 1972, 13 of them were shot dead, you know, just protesting. They were interned just without trial. They would take homes, whole neighborhoods. The army would come in and just take them out and put them in prison. People, you know.
I mean, that was what,
Unionism.
72?
Yeah.
Less than 50
The
years.
unionism relies, and the Orange State relied on these threats, and NICRA was another internal threat.
Yeah.
And the fact that one man, one vote was too much of a demand for the Orange State to reform to meant that it had to be smashed.
Yeah.
It had to go.
And it's worth pointing out that many of the shock troopers weren't British soldiers. They were literally unionist people who were self-organising in order to stamp out like this Catholic threat. So you can see how ingrained the view of the empire and of unionism was within several communities that organised their own pogroms. Like if you go to Belfast today, you'll find that Belfast has the largest peace walls in all of Europe, separating the two communities. One of the offices that's aligned to the CP called Trademark overlooks these walls, and you can see them separating the communities. And one of the places that they're at has a gate, and it still closes at 9 p.m. every single day. And that's one of the gates where people from the loyalist community flooded through, torches, guns, and started pogroms against Catholic people. So it's not like it was like just British soldiers committing atrocities. Quite a significant portion of the loyalist and unionist community got involved in it and readily partook in it.
It's just so crazy how you can convince a people to hate someone. Like, that's them. Like, it's just so
But it's
fucked up.
Again, the Orange State was not a liberal democracy. The B specials who were an auxiliary police force, they were allowed to carry guns in plain clothes. They were allowed to do all this. So that repressive state apparatus, the judicial system, the police, and later on the army, there was no separation from the parliamentary state at all. They were one and the same thing. They were the same people. Whereas in liberal democracy, they're seen as two separate things.
Well, so I just wanted to ask, because you mentioned the sort of loyalist sort of factions like the paramilitaries. A lot of them had support from the British government itself, didn't they?
Yeah, so like in the
Illusion is no illusion.
So the British state pursued a policy of Ulsterisation, similar to Vietnamisation. So they shared information with loyalist paramilitaries. They recruited a local arm of the army called the Ulster Defence Regiment, UDR. One of the major problems for the British Army at the time was just they didn't know the lay of the land. So the IRA and any other Republican paramilitaries had no automatic advantage. A British soldier doesn't know the streets in and out, and they don't know the difference between a South Derry accent and a Tyrone accent. Whereas that would be easily identifiable to a locally recruited force. And they know faces, they know names, and that policy of Ulsterisation crippled the area, essentially. So they had to pursue. By the time the hunger strikes came around, they were essentially beaten militarily. They had to pursue an electoral route, and briefly they pursued ballot box and Armalite. But again, if you're shooting people in the street, whether they're British soldiers or off-duty police officers or not, the British state aren't going to allow you into the political discussion as a legitimate political force. So Sinn Féin eventually had no other option but to completely capitulate to electoral politics if they wanted a seat at the table. But that also meant abandoning any socialist rhetoric and that as well. So and then to become part of the executive in Stormont, the Good Friday Agreement meant that everyone had to move to the centre. So the DUP, formed by Ian Paisley, was a hardline unionist faction, more hardline than the unionist government at the time. For them and Sinn Féin to be in government, well, absence of government now, means that everyone had to move to the centre.
Hasn't really changed much since then for today. Sinn Féin continues to slide to adopt kind of social democratic view of the world, to adopt social democratic rhetoric, to adopt social democratic solutions to capitalist problems. It doesn't, for all the talk of socialism from their members or even on their statements or on their website says they're for socialism, but if you look at their policies, if you look at how they examine the world and how they understand the world, it's very much as a social democratic entity that's there to patch up and try to make capitalism kind of nice. But you can't do that. It's lesson number one. You can't have nice capitalism. It simply doesn't work, and that's probably one of the biggest contentions CYM members and young Ogre Sinn Féin members have, is that we don't recognise this parliamentary route to socialism, whereas they very, I could say, stringently insist upon it all the time. There was a recent article they put up saying we're for democratic socialism, and that's kind of the same language that all social democrats use: democratic socialism / socialist democracy or whatever. Like it's all to obfuscate the actual word of socialism and to try to draw away from it and to try to distinguish the two. So I
They
think
just mean capitalism.
exactly
That's
the
all they
management of capitalism. So it's one of the, I think, key distinctions between the CYM and other youth organisations in Ireland is that a significant proportion of them do argue for democratic socialism through peaceful means and all this kind of stuff. And it's ironic that a lot of the criticism members of Sinn Féin give to the CP or to the CYM is that, oh, you didn't participate in the armed struggle. But the irony is that really, despite them actively participating in the armed struggle, where are they now? And what has Sinn Féin become today? It's become a political party that's got very poor political education. Its members on local authorities vote to privatise public land, for example, one day, or they do something else the next day. The only logical consistency in their organisation is that they need to get into government one way or the other. And you can tell that. You can tell that from their ranks, from the way they speak, from the way they express themselves, from who their leaders are. Even the change from Jerry Adams to Mary Lou MacDonald was all about a aesthetic and the presentation of Sinn Féin as a party that could galvanise middle class votes. That's what it was about, because Mary Lou MacDonald lives in a very nice leafy suburb in a lovely 4-bedroom house and looks like a middle class person. And that's what the transformation is all about. So despite maybe 20 years ago, young people joining Sinn Féin because it had a connection to a paramilitary wing and you get Molotov cocktails and throw them at the army base or whatever, that reputation is long gone. And young people don't look to Ogre Sinn Féin to anything. I don't think there's any organisation young people look to and go, that's the one I want to be in. But across the left, the CYM is definitely, absolutely, without a question of a doubt, the organisation for left young communists in the country.
Well, Sinn Féin has essentially faced the same problem that New Labour did. In the 90s, they had to become electable.
Yeah.
They had to wear suits. And that raises the question of what could the IRA have done?
Yeah.
Within the IRA, at the time, there was no radical political education. There was a group of prisoners, the Communist League of Prisoners or something.
League of Communist
Yeah,
Republicans.
League of Communist Republicans.
Led by Tommy McCartney.
Yeah, led by McCartney. Which sort of analysed what could have been done. They could have supported. It wouldn't have been hard for the IRA at the time, who was mainly made up of rural farmers and long-term unemployed young men in the urban centres as well, to buy into socialist politics or to buy into revolutionary politics. That wasn't a massive leap for them to take, but they didn't do it. They could have went down the Basque and formed workers' cooperatives or organised the economy along a system of workers' co-ops, and they chose not to do it.
Yeah. They made it. There's lots of history books. There's an Ardèche of Provisional Sinn Féin back from the 80s where they have a discussion on electoral politics and this kind of concept of dual power and whether should they develop dual power, and they simply opt not to. Arguably, you could say they had the resources, they had the manpower, they had the influence to do so, but they chose not to, and they're at a rut now. I think Sinn Féin seems to be in crisis, is that it needs to further draw to the centre to become an organisation that appeals to middle class people who vote for Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, our two main ruling parties, in order to actually consolidate a base. And the more they do that, the less working class people that they had in the past will actually vote for them. And you can see the makeup of their membership is that their new up and coming people are all college students who don't have any class politics, who have no political education. You can see that, and we see that, and it's quite an interesting social phenomenon to observe in a transformation of a political organisation that has the history that it has. Another organisation, by the way, an interesting one, I think, is the IRSP and the INLA, led by Seamus Costello, which explicitly took a socialist Republican line and broke away and attempted to do something that no political organisation in the country was doing. That was kind of synthesised the way Connolly had the social and national question. Now, Seamus Costello was assassinated by members of the Workers' Party in cold blood, essentially, and executed because he was a threat to their existence and because he was a threat to, I suppose, the political growth of other Republican organisations. But since then, I would argue nothing has really taken place in a similar manner. I like to think the CYM obviously is looking to uphold that mantle, but it's still an uphill battle. It's an uphill battle to galvanise the exact same people that the Republican movement galvanised a long time ago. To me, it seems like the alt-right is targeting the exact same people in many ways that young communist organisations are. Young, disenfranchised men and women who feel alienated from what capitalism has done to their society. And that's what the Republican movement kind of was able to galvanise back then. And I think that's partly why you didn't have such a factionalised left in Ireland. You had like 3 maybe Republican organisations and their paramilitary wings, and that was it. And now you have like 50. There's more Republican splits than Trotskyite splits in Ireland, if you actually count them out.
Gosh.
Except Republican splits mean something.
Some of them are just oriented around who gets to deal drugs in this area and who doesn't. Like,
the sort of question I wanted to ask is, how do you feel or what's your view on the kind of modern paramilitary groups that have sprung up since the Good Friday Agreement?
They haven't sprung up since the Good Friday Agreement. Okay. They are just the remnants of what was.
Yeah.
They have constituency in the communities where they are, otherwise they wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
They while there's British occupation in Ireland, while there's British military occupation in Ireland, there will always be a violent response to that. And I think that's the materialist position to take.
Yeah. And having said that, these groups don't exist outside of their constituency. Like, despite the claims of whatever organisation that they're all Ireland, we would know for fact that they don't exist outside of Cregan and Derry and West Belfast. Yeah. And unfortunately, the revolution isn't going to happen from West Belfast. It'll certainly play a role, but any revolution in Ireland has to be a national one that is cross-border. And these organisations simply aren't capable of delivering it. Never mind the fact that they're just centred in those locations. They don't have any political education, which is key and central to any socialist revolution. There is literally no point in having a revolution if the people carrying it out have no political education.
The provisionals did this as well, and it's something that a lot of militant Republican groups have done since and made the same mistake. They call for a socialist republic, but there's no political education, so it's completely unscientific. It's very utopian, and there's sort of we'll just get the Brits out and it'll be okay on the day sort of mentality around a lot of the militant Republican groups. So it's not based in any scientific analysis of socialism or anything like that. And another thing is that their military wings have complete control over the party. Usually, which is in direct opposition to how a Marxist-Leninist party should operate, and that is the party has complete control over the gun.
The Connolly Youth Movement really has only come back in the last couple of years as an organisation that's known on the left. There was a spurt of activism in 2002, 2003. It didn't go beyond Dublin. But since 2008, since 2009, who I think Lenin called capitalism their own gravediggers, in many ways, that's exactly what has happened in Ireland, is that young people are looking for alternatives in understanding how capitalism functions and how social phenomena functions. So what we've seen is that despite the bombardment of anti-communist propaganda, the CYM has been able to pick up members in Cork, Dublin, Belfast, Limerick, Galway, Waterford, which are really the main centres, and soon Derry, which the CYM has never had a presence in, and to expand and to recruit and to grow. So obviously there is a desire to understand, why are my conditions so shit? Why do I feel depressed about what's for me? What about my work conditions? What about my life conditions? How do I even understand my place as a young person in a hyper-capitalist, hyper-exploitative system? And I think the CYM has kind of been able to answer some of those questions, or at least point young people in the right direction into understanding those questions. So since maybe 2012, 2013, 2014, there's been a bit of a resurgence to a rapid kind of growth in the organisation. I always say that one of the key reasons there is a growth in the CYM and there isn't a growth in other youth organisations who are, say, competing or are rivals is because we're fairly bluntly honest about what our intentions are for Ireland. we're not here to trick people into socialism. We're not here to elect anybody. We're not here to do anything. We're here to agitate, to educate, and to organize young people, to give them the means to enact their own emancipation, arm them if need be, participate in the violent insurrection. That's our stated goal and objective, and we should never lose sight of that, because the opportunity to actually carry these things out comes very rarely. But in the era we're living in this late imperialistic era, I think we have that opportunity, and I think a lot of people sense that their apathy is connected to a lack of agency, and they want that agency. So I think the CYM gives agency to people, young people who are of a political persuasion. I think it motivates them to do things that they didn't think they would do before, not just from a political manner, but also from like a sporting manner, a health manner, a self-education manner, and a mental health and emotional health manner. I think one of the biggest things we find in our organization is that a lot of young people in general struggle with dealing with the world around them, so they fall into depression or whatever, and that the CYM is one of their outlets. It's how you grab agency of your life and you say, look, I'm actually taking control back of myself and my environment, and this is the means by which I fight and improve my life. So I think we've been able to tap into that. 5 years ago when I joined, there was 9 members sitting downstairs in the opposite room in the Connolly Youth Movement. Today we're past 100 members easily, and I don't mean, when I say members, I don't mean they're members on paper. I mean members who will turn out, who will participate,
Who are active.
I would say cadres, many of which will step into the ranks of the Communist Party. So it's kind of big transformation of the organization in the short space of 5 years. And when we talk about 2020 on our executive meetings or our branch meetings, we're talking about very aggressive and rapid growth to fill a vacuum that's simply not being filled. So I think there's huge appetite for it, and we've been able to tap into that appetite, and we've built ourselves a national platform that no other youth organisation has, in a way that's unconventional and outside the box and unorthodox. I think that's why people come to the CYM. Obviously, we have a big uphill battle, but the Irish Citizens Army only had 200 people participate in the 1916 Rising, and a lot of us, I think most of us in the CYM feel that we would rather take the opportunity to overthrow capitalism and die rather than have to sit through it and waste the opportunity and lose the opportunity and miss it, and simply go look back on it 40 years in time and go, look, we had the opportunity but we never took it. I think that's what drives a lot of us, our members, and it's a very inspiring thing, really.
And Ho Chi Minh started with 7 people in a room, and look at what he did.
I mean, if you look at the CPC, that was 20 people, and now it's 90 million. It's,
I think having 9 and then going to 200 in such a small amount of time is huge.
So I wanted to ask a question about sort of recent activism within the last year. I basically wanted you to sort of explain the Connolly barracks situation that happened, because I remember reading an article about that and being quite interested. So I'd kind of like you to elaborate on that.
I had the pleasure of living there for 2.5 years. It was essentially an occupation of a derelict residential building that was still habitable with a bit of work. We broke into it, we took it over, we changed the locks, we established our possession over it, if you will, and we lived in it. And comrades from the Cork CYM branch still live in it.
All right.
So in a nutshell,
so is it still occupied then?
Yeah, it's still occupied by Cork CYM members. It's very visible. If you walk past it, it's very obvious that it's a political occupation. There's flags flying. There's a big thing out front.
Where is this located?
In Cork, down south.
Okay.
And one of the things is that
I listened to your episode about it. You talked about it on, I think, Radical Reflection.
Yeah. David actually came down to the house to record the episode. So the house was one of the biggest, in terms of publicity, it was one of the biggest publicity events for the CYM. And it's not really about the house. It's more about the fact that we were trying to establish the idea that our members in our organisation doesn't believe in the right to private property being greater than the right to housing. And I did a few radio interviews, for example, and there was like galaxy brain explosion over the idea that the right to private housing or the right to private property wasn't respected. And that's kind of the point, is that we're not here to placate or participate in the niceties of liberal kind of parliamentary democracy. We're here to smash it and destroy everybody who stands in the way. That's in a nutshell, like that's what it's about.
Yeah.
Because I feel, and I'm sure my comrades can probably weigh in similarly, is that Trotskyist organizations, soft left Republican organizations, they're playing the board game. But the goal is not to play the board game, but it's to flip it over and basically make our own rules.
Yeah.
But that's the objective. And that's what we're trying to recruit young people to. So Connolly Barracks was one of those little unconventional projects that I think solidified that point. It got the publicity the CYM deserves, in my opinion, and it got this discussion going. Now, look, the long-term goal was to encourage other young people to occupy houses. Did they? I don't know. There was an occupation in Dublin called Take Back the City. Was it inspired by Connolly Barracks? Probably not. But I'm sure people, and I know for a fact that people in Take Back the City knew of Connolly Barracks, and people still know about Connolly Barracks. The funny thing is, they use it as an insult. They say, is that the only thing the CYM does? But the irony is that their youth organisation doesn't do half as much. So, does that answer your question? I hope it does. I don't know.
But like what we're trying to do with the Communist Party and the CYM is we recognise the leftist mob. We recognise it's growing. It's rising every fucking day of the week. It's growing. People are getting more and more pissed off with neoliberalism and the state of things as they are. But we're setting up a foundation of radical communism, of an understanding of the state, of capitalism, of imperialism, of what that is about, and of our role in changing that. And we're building a foundation, brick by painstaking brick. That means that when there's crises and explosions of capitalism, we're the ones who are going to benefit, and all the other parties that have kowtowed to electoralism and have just become totally ingrained in that sphere, with turnout decreasing. Like in the locals, loads of left seats were lost, and we're going to have a general election in a couple of months. And our message, I don't take any pleasure in that, but it will be vindicated, and the left will lose seats. And, you know, the organisation that has strong revolutionary education, communist understanding, that lives and breathes communism like we try to do, that we struggle to do. It's not something that comes naturally, it's a struggle to do that. We will benefit in the long term.
It's worth pointing out the sort of disenfranchised people we're recruiting. Like, we've picked up three people who've served in the army, for example, and the naval service.
I think veterans are a great.
Yeah, and that says quite a lot, because the rank and file, quite a lot of the Irish Citizens Army people were formerly members of the British Army, Connolly included. So it's kind of telling, but we should be talking about revolution. We should be openly preparing for it. We should be seditious. We should be honest about our intentions. We're not trying to trick people into socialism. We're not trying to win a social democratic left-wing government for the next 5 years. The objective is to overthrow the state and attempt the dictatorship of the proletariat, with all the imperfections that it comes with. And if we're honest about our objectives, I genuinely believe people will rally behind and with us. It's not just about follow the CYM, we have the right program. It's about collective political education and a collective rising against the state. The fight's not between the CYM and the state. The fight's between the people and the state, and that's our goal. And I think we're making headway, first of all, in understanding it, but also in actually carrying out activities towards that end. So the only thing I can say is join the fucking CYM if you're living in Ireland.
Thanks for listening. This is Talia.
James.
Shane.
Ewan.
Rory.
Jack.
Alex.
All from Dublin. Thanks for listening to Proles of the Round Table. Bye.
Is our James Connolly? Where, oh, where is that gallant man? He's gone far to organize the union. be free. Where, oh, where is our citizen army? Where, oh, where is that gallant band? They are gone far to join the great rebellion and smash the bonds of slavery. They carried him up to Kilmainham. They carried him up to the jail, and they shot him down on a bright May morning, and quickly laid him in his gown. Who mourns the death of this great man? Who mourns the death of this great man? Bury me down in the yon green gardens with Union men on every side. They buried him in the yon green gardens with the Union men on every side, and they swore that they would forge a mighty weapon, that James Connolly's name would live again with pride. Where, oh, where is our James Connolly? He's here. Where, oh, where is that gallant man? He has gone far to join the great rebellion